two. I've gotten my two.
You've gotten the second one?
Yes, sir.
No, I'm looking forward to the second one.
Yeah, it was a non-event.
Well, that's great. Which one did you get?
I did MUSC, the
I
Pfizer.
meant the Pfizer.
Yeah.
You got the Pfizer?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's the one I got. Also.
Yeah, it was. Did you have any reaction the first one?
Not really.
No. So you should be fine the second one.
I'm looking forward to it. Although I'm still wear a mask afterwards.
Oh, me too. Me too. But it's good to have it behind you.
Oh yeah, you do feel a sense of. It should feel like you won some award or something after you get
Yeah.
At least I did. Because I don't know about you all, it seems like more people are getting this thing who are trying to take the proper precautions. People wearing the masks and safe distancing and, somehow coming across it. I mean, my son-in-law recently had it. My daughter makes him change clothes in the garage before he can come in the house.
Yeah. Yeah. Good for her.
Yeah. I mean, he's an attorney. He works in the federal court system in Columbia. So, I mean, it's not like he's out there, doing heavy work, labor, I should say.
Yeah. Let me tell the mayor you're waiting for him.
That's okay. Yeah, we got it. I think we got a quorum.
Yes, we do have a quorum and we are live.
All right, great. You give it a few more minutes for the mayor to join us.
Okay.
Councilman Waring, did you see those two women in California that got arrested for dressing up as grannies and trying to get COVID shots?
Oh, really? No, I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, that was something funny. It was like two young women that really wanted to get their shots, and
I'm really rooting for obviously improved rollout on this thing. Glad we're concentrating on that instead of some of the other things. Hey, Mr. Mayor.
Sure.
We're talking about the rollout of the vaccine. Any word from Councilman Shade?
Just saw him.
I know he'll be on soon. Well, let's do this. Let's call the meeting to order, and let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. I'll say it. Eternally Father, as we come before you, I want to thank you for the many blessings that you provide, knowing that it doesn't have to be done, but through your amazing grace, you provide for many so much. Thank you for our leadership in the country, our state, and our city. Thank you for the staff that during this COVID environment now, greater than a year, we've been able to operate this city above and beyond in so many departments. And please let them know, from the department heads to recent hires, let them know that they appreciate it very much. We pray for those less fortunate and do what we can as believers in your word, help things better for them. And we pray for those in harm's way in the military that fight to protect us and keep our way of life. Watch out for them and their families. These prayers we ask for in your name. Let us all say amen.
Amen.
All right. We got a group of minutes to approve for December 14th, January 11th, January 25th, and February 8th. What's the pleasure?
Move for approval of those minutes.
Properly moved, and hopefully you have a second.
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. Any questions on those minutes? Hearing none, all in favor, would you please say aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Councilman Shahid, welcome. We just started the meeting and just approved the minutes, so that's where we are on the agenda. Item C, set a public hearing.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna ask Chip McQueen to give you an update on that.
All right, great. Mr. McQueen?
Yes, sir. If I can, I guess I'm okay to share my screen. I just did this for several of you.
Yeah.
This is Floyd Drive, and we just went to real estate about the ability to quit claim. So Floyd Drive will essentially be moved from here where it dead ends at a cul-de-sac to here where it runs along the southern boundary line of the E&G easement. Bees Ferry Road would be up here. West Ashley Circle is over here. And the Walmart is in, if I can zoom out a little bit, the Walmart would be on this tract here. This is an undeveloped parcel owned by Whitfield Construction. Can you guys see the GIS map now? Or is it still the other
Still
map?
Plat. It's still a plat.
Okay, all right, let me see if I can share a different screen then. Okay, and then, so this is Charleston County GIS.
Okay.
This is the property that we're looking at. That's Floyd Drive. That's the area that'll be abandoned. And this will be, you can kind of see where a road's coming in there. And then this will be I think the mayor asked at the last meeting about what's back here. This is sort of an undeveloped tract owned by Whitfield Construction Company that I'm sure will be subdivided at some point in the future. And at that point, Floyd Drive would likely be extended. But really the request today is just to set a public hearing to close and abandon that little cul-de-sac at Floyd Drive. Once the dedication process, the subdivision of that plat I showed you previously is completed, the other area of Floyd Drive will be dedicated to the city. We're going to deed to that, and then a drainage easement associated with it. And they'll take back this portion of Floyd Drive. We have an easement, not a deed, so we don't own fee simple title to it. We'll just quit claim it to the adjoining landowner, which is, I forget the name of it, but it's the owner of the, I think those are the Floyd Drive Apartments is the larger development there.
Okay, any questions? of
For
Mr.
the 9th, is that correct? The 9th of March, that public hearing?
Yes, sir.
Any more questions of Mr. McQueenie or Mr. O'Brien?
Yeah, I just want to complain that we didn't get all that pretty pictorial presentation at the last real estate committee meeting. He added a lot more fun-looking diagrams on there than what we had with black and white stuff. So
Well, as we all know, there's a higher hurdle to be crossed at Public Works.
I had 5 extra minutes here. So that's true. Yeah, it's tough going before Public Works Committee.
All right, Councilman Griffin.
Yes, sir. This really isn't the time or place to talk about this, but I will tell you that at some point, as these projects go through the pipeline, there's a lot of resistance from the community out there, a lot. Talking about high density development in an area that has a chokehold for traffic. And I have yet to hear from the developer on this. I'm going to try to reach out to them personally. But myself and Councilmember Shealy and Councilmember Brady, we all have to be very aware of this because, just in the last couple of years, they've built very high density. And by giving them this easement, it's going to allow them to really make that property more valuable and eventually build a heck of a lot more out there. The widening of Glen McConnell obviously is going to be a big help. But, that's still a couple of years away. And, they're actively working on the widening of Glen McConnell. But we have seen between this proposed development that's coming and then the expansions of Carolina Bay, that area, along with Bolton Landing and everything that's come through there in the last 5 years or so, has created quite a traffic impediment. So we just have to be careful there. Obviously public hearing, that's great. We want the public to be able to be a part of this conversation. But I can promise you guys that there's going to be a lot of pushback against the future of that road. Because I went from a road that was a dead end that truckers were parking their trucks on overnight next to the Walmart to now it is a sprawling community. So just be aware that that's going to be something that definitely isn't going to end with this discussion tonight. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yep. And
Any other observations?
I was just going to, Councilman Waring, if I could just clarify so really we have a duty to maintain this little cul-de-sac here, and all we're giving up the duty to maintain, and they're getting the property back. They're giving us the 0.76 acres, which will actually, they can do that anyway. If we don't abandon this, we're still going to have to maintain it for whatever reason. but that's not going to stop them from doing the Floyd Drive. I mean, if they comply with city specifications for dedication, we'll accept it. They'll submit a bond and all that kind of stuff. But kind of the only difference this would make in their project is that this would be a cul-de-sac instead of something they could put green space or whatever else on. So it really shouldn't allow much additional development. I think, and I'll talk to TNT between now and later, but it would probably help with traffic, because otherwise all these parcels down here are going to have to come straight from Bees Ferry Road. Whereas this sort of gives you an alternative route by going, if it dead ends here and they don't dedicate this, then you got to figure out some way for them to get to this property. And that's another curb cut probably on Bees Ferry Road. So it should be beneficial, I would think, to the area, but I'll check with TNT and Stormwater just in case.
Okay, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just wanted to ask, is this public hearing going to be in front of this committee or in front of city council?
City council.
City council, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, any more input on this issue? Do we have a motion?
I'll move for approval for a public hearing.
Second.
Okay, properly moved. Any additional discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please. say
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. No old business, no acceptance and dedications. Mr. O'Brien, the temporary encroachments.
Yes, sir. All we have this week are, we have a bunch of irrigation and a few fences. We've inspected all of them and recommended for approval of those and given you this information only.
Okay, I got one question. That's number 13, installing a 6-foot wood fence, encroaching on the city drainage easement.
Yes, sir.
Will that create an issue down the road?
Every time we install a fence on a drainage easement, our inspector meets out there with a member of Matt Fountain's stormwater maintenance. We make sure that there are not going to be any obstructions, that they don't cover up the inlets, and if there's a swell, we make that. And we also have even had in the past, if they start maintenance, if they find out there is an issue, the encroachment agreement says they have to remove the fences, and we will write them a letter and state that.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Well, let's give them for information. We're down to item H, right now, H1, stormwater management update. Item 1 is an ordinance to amend chapter 27. Councilman Griffin, you asked that this be placed.
Yes, sir. Yes, this is an ordinance that I proposed back in 19, and our staff came up with an abbreviated sort of blanket ordinance that was citywide. It got through first reading unanimously, and then it sat as deferred item for several months when this was brought back up at council. I think that the last meeting I said that I would bring it back up and start over. So here we are. I actually took this out, took our old ordinance, typed it up myself. I'm not going to charge the city for my services, but I typed it up, and this is what we have. Obviously, this is something that from the day one that I've been in office, our guys over in Church Creek have been pounding the drum. What can we do to just get a big limit on development in very low-lying areas, especially in wetlands? Obviously we've spent a lot of money over these past 3.5 years on studies, a lot of money. And I thought this was some low-hanging fruit that we could get something on the books, especially in Johns Island and Church Creek were directly mentioned in the Dutch Dialogues Charleston report several times. They came up with elevation categories. I literally took this straight from the Dutch Dialogue. So this is just a first reading. I would hope that we could get this out of committee and get it in front of council. And if we could get it past the first reading, then we certainly could maybe figure out, get a lot more feedback from all of our different partners on what they think. But with everybody I've shared it to so far, I think that there's a lot of common sense reasoning for why we would not build in very low elevations in Church Creek and Johns Island. So that's why I brought it up. I hope everybody got a chance to read it, open for all feedback, and hopefully we can get it out of this committee and get it in front of the full council.
Okay. Any, well, let's get a motion on the floor and then we get into discussion.
I'll move for approval.
No second, well, I'll second it for the purpose of discussion. Any input from committee members? Mr. Fountain, do you have any input on this? Oh, I'm sorry, Councilman Chie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I remember when we were discussing this back, seems like a couple of years ago. But as mentioned earlier, we have done through several studies, and around this time that this was coming forward, we were in the middle of revising our stormwater manual. And I think that we also adopted the Dutch dialogues as part of that stormwater manual as well. My concern with this ordinance, and I read it again after I received it from Councilmember Griffin, was how it was going to come into conflict with that stormwater manual revision. That revision encompassed a series of workshops that included, at that time, Councilmember White and myself, and included engineers, lawyers, folks from our stakeholders from, I think, the Department of Natural Resources, the Office of OCRM, and several other state agencies. And Mr. Fountain could probably supplement many people I've left off on that list. Folks from Planning Department were on there as well. It was a very comprehensive, very drawn out, extensive discussion about improving our stormwater manual, updating it, and making it much more restrictive. My concern with this ordinance is that it's going to come into conflict, I'm afraid, with parts of that stormwater manual that we've adopted as an ordinance. And that's my main concern with it. I mean, the simplicity of it, I understand what we're trying to accomplish here. And I think it got narrowed down to specific areas within the city boundaries. But maybe Mr. Fountain can address some of my concerns as to how this may come into conflict with our stormwater manual and the Dutch dialogues.
Okay, any other council member input?
Can we put the actual ordinance up on the screen?
Who would do that? Oh, we got any screen shaver? Can Ms. Ellington, Ms. Simmons, can you do that?
Yes. Oh, okay.
All right, thank you.
Chip, you beat me to it.
No problem.
Okay, I've got it up on my, putting it up on my screen. Can everybody see it? Okay, Councilman Griffin.
Can see it, yeah.
I mean, you have some input on it?
No, sir, I will, but whoever else wants to go first.
Okay, any comments from Councilmember Pell or Mr. Mayor, do you have any comments?
Sure.
Okay,
you mind if I weigh in?
Councilmember Pell.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Harry, I appreciate you putting this together. I think this is a big part of our job is putting together, proposed legislation and working it through the process. And start off by saying, I am in full agreement that we should not be building and developing in ecologically fragile systems, whether it be on, Church Creek or on James Island or Johns Island or Cane Hoy, or wherever the case may be. That's not a good way to develop. Sprawl has a lot of negative impacts, especially when it's situated in ecologically fragile areas. So no disagreement there whatsoever. The thing that I would say is that when we're trying to approach an issue like this is some complicated stuff, both from a technical and from a legal perspective. And I tend to think that if we are going to make some tweaks to the use of fill, things of that nature, we ought to do that through an amendment to our stormwater manual, if for no other reason than to just have a more kind of that's where the regulations on fill are right now, and whether we need to dial that up a few clicks, that's the most I guess natural place for these amendments to go, as opposed to sort of a general portion of our code. And on the legal side of things, I just think we need to be cautious of how very strict development regulations like this could impact property rights and entitlements and people that are at various points through the development review process, especially folks that have picked up vested rights. I think that's an interesting legal question. I think you can approach it from a variety of angles, but there are some potentially serious implications about sort of dialing it up to a 10 on this issue. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying we should go into it clear-eyed with a full understanding of the potential legal ramifications. Two other quick points I'll put on the table, because this is actually like a very interesting issue and a very important one that I think we all need to talk about is, we say that we don't want development to take place in inappropriate places, right? The way you do that through best practices, in my opinion, is to attack that head on through zoning, right? I mean, zoning tells you what you can build and where you can't build and how much you can build and things of that nature. What we're talking about when we talk about fill regulations and things of those lines, that is some very technical code related stuff. I mean, in other words, you can have a situation here if you don't align your zoning with your code technical requirements, such as Stormwater Manual. You can get into a situation where the zoning is saying go 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 go. We're allowing all this density. We're allowing all this development. Come on, developers, develop here. But then they reach TRC and then it's no fill, right? So I'm not saying that this is. I guess what I'm suggesting is we can address a lot of this earlier in the development review process from a zoning perspective. And it's my understanding, I haven't checked in with our planning staff and the comp plan, but when I talked to Jacob about this a while back, we were talking about overlay zones based on hydrological features, down zoning, low-lying areas, up zoning, upland areas. That's an example of how we can put some of these zoning measures into place. And then lastly, what I would say is that is in terms of designated which areas of the city these rules would apply to, I think we have to do sort of an all or nothing approach, because what I don't want to have happen is we place very strict regulations on Johns Island and Church Creek, which incentivizes perhaps poorly conceived development in West Ashley, James Island, and Canal. I think if we're going to do it, we're going to need to do it and apply a consistent set of rules citywide based upon the satisfaction of some objective hydrological or ecological or elevation related criteria. But I think this is a good start. I think this is an important issue. We don't need to be developing in poor places, way out into the hinterlands. It's negative from our traffic infrastructure standpoint. It's negative from a flooding standpoint. It's negative from extension of city services standpoint. I mean, I can go on and on and on. It's not a good thing to be doing. We need to be putting our development and our density along existing corridors within urban areas. That's the way to do it in the 21st century. But good start. I think it's an important discussion to have. I'm really interested to hear what Matt has to say about it, and would just encourage us to continue this discussion. I think it's a good discussion to be having.
Okay, good. Ms. Simmons, unless anybody needs it, can you take the ordinance down so I can get the full screen back? And right, great. Good to see everybody back again. Number one, very good comments, Councilmember Bill. Mr. Fountain? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. I saw Mr. Mayor hand, and then I'll come to Mr. Fountain. Mr. Mayor?
Well, thank you. And not to be repetitive, but I would like to reiterate a couple of points that Councilmember Rappel made. I certainly understand Councilmember Griffin's goal here of limiting development in those low-lying and ecologic areas that had been outlined when we did the Dutch dialogues. They focused on 4 areas of the city just because at that time, we felt they needed some extra scrutiny. But it doesn't mean, to Mr. Appel's point, that any good sense further limitation or requirement shouldn't apply to the whole city. We had just studied those particular areas, but if there's a good proposal to come forward, I would concur that it should apply everywhere. Now, when Councilmember Griffin, when you first brought this matter forward some time ago, it ended up kind of getting put on the shelf, as you know, and the main reason was we had incorporated a lot of improvements to our stormwater manual that went in effect, shortly thereafter, about the same time. And not coincidentally, number 2 on our agenda here is to discuss the process of updating that stormwater manual. So, and Mr. Fountain will share more information with us about that. So some of those items that were areas of concern that were raised got addressed by the stormwater manual. Can it be improved upon further? I believe it can, and we should continue that discussion. Now, thirdly, I wanted to, again, Councilmember Appel brought this up, but how do we best address the issue citywide? And that's through zoning. I concur. And I don't think we've shared yet, but we will in the very near future, the analysis that was done by our same Dutch Dialogues partners as part of our comprehensive plan review. We'll be bringing that forward to the Planning Commission and to Council in the next few weeks, I believe. And you'll see, again, it's not just Church Creek and Johns Island, but it's citywide, wherever you're really near water, that you have this issue of marsh encroachment as sea level rise continues. And so the thought of changing policy, again, I think will be should be citywide. And to put it in a nutshell, it's basically this: try to stay away from the water and build and develop on the high ground. I mean, it's common sense. So how do you get there? By zoning changes, by additional improvements to the stormwater manual, and perhaps by even building code requirements that get specific. But what I do fear, even though this is a great vehicle for us to have this discussion and make the necessary additional changes in the direction I believe we've already been heading, is to have a blanket, one size fits all. And I'll give you an example. So say I owned a piece of property in the ecologic zone, which is from 6 to 10 feet above sea level, and I did a stormwater management plan for my property. It included not only appropriate engineered drainage, but appropriate mitigation of storing stormwater on my site and everything. I was doing everything right, but I needed a cubic yard of fill over here to make things work out. But with my engineering plan in place, I don't have any negative impact, not only on my neighbors, but anybody in that drainage basin. So to have a blanket one size fits all really denies that person their property rights to develop the property in a very thoughtful and appropriate fashion. So I get the message, and I concur that we need to be careful about where we're building. I think we're heading in that direction, but honestly, I think we need to approach it through further refinement of the stormwater manual, through zoning changes that will be recommended in our comprehensive plan, and even looking at our building requirements as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go, Mr. Felton, I'm gonna go back to Councilman Griffith and then come to you.
Just to answer a couple of the questions that have been raised first, Mr. Mayor, your example is a great one. And that would be covered by the section of the ordinance that states that if an exemption needs to be granted, that it would come before the Public Works and Utilities Committee. So there can be exemptions, but it just, this would obviously be the majority of the properties. But your example is a great one. In terms of what Councilmember Shea had said, it states in there in that ordinance that I wrote that if there was any irregularities, can't say that word.
Regularities.
Irregularities
I got you.
between this ordinance and the stormwater manual, that the more restrictive practice would be the one that was used. So a lot of these questions that you're asking, I did put that into this proposed ordinance. But more importantly, at the end of the day, my intentions are I represent a district where I have people that literally couldn't live in their homes for years because they were flooded out repeatedly. Every single year they'd be flooded out. I had people that were paying 2 or 3 mortgages at one time. I've got whole neighborhoods that have been torn down because they should have never been built. To say that Church Creek and this basin is like the rest of the city, or like Johns Island's like the rest of the city, just isn't true. And so 2 years ago when I brought this up, it's kind of ironic. A lot of the members of council were saying that they didn't want to support this thing all the way through because it shouldn't be a blanket ordinance. It should have different sections that are looked at. And then we had the Dutch Dialogue report come out, and we spent so much money and time and resources on these studies. I mean, to me, we're doing a disservice if we're spending taxpayer dollars, spending years studying these things. We get the results and the reports, and then we don't do anything about them. Now, I'm not saying that we're not doing anything. I believe that our staff has done yeoman's work on the Stormwater Manual. And I appreciate this update today. But the fact of the matter is, had I not tried to pull that item off of being deferred, we probably wouldn't be getting this update today. And it's very frustrating to keep voting on these issues, to bring people to come in and look at these areas, come up with these different zones, talk about Johns Island and Church Creek, and give our citizens this sense that we're getting ready to make some power moves, and then we sit on it for years. We've been sitting on some studies since 1984 that people have just given up hope that we're ever going to get some things accomplished. And I don't believe that's the case. I think that we all have the best of intentions. I think all of us care so deeply about our districts. But I want you to know that this is just, this is the one thing that, I ran on from the beginning. I promised District 10 that I would always have their back when it came to the flooding. And it's just something that's not going away anytime soon. And I thought that, this would be a common sense way to look at it, but, it's obvious that there's a lot of different interpretations of how we can go about it. But, I would love it if we could at least bring this out of the committee so that our council could look at it and take it up. As, we did do that before. And I thought I was being, fair to start over. But I would love it if we could at least get it out of this committee so that our council could take a look at it tomorrow night.
Okay, Councilman Shea, and then I really am going to go with Mr. Fountain after that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was just going to ask that perhaps we hear from Mr. Fountain about this, and so how this would apply in our existing ordinances, our existing manuals and policies.
Okay, Mr. Fountain, before you speak, let me say something, but you can come off of mute. I am, number one, this spurred some very good conversation. So one of the things I want to do as we progress through this, everybody who contributed to this so far has contributed very positive conversation. So in that vein is certainly how I'd like to move forward on this one. We've had so much successes in our stormwater drainage department. It's that momentum, even with your suggestion, everybody says it's got some good parts to it. So someplace out of it, I hope we can find out whatever conflicts we have, Mr. Fountain, with this particular ordinance and what currently exists. And then maybe, hopefully we get to the point of some of the good parts that we can tweak. If not today, certainly plan for it moving forward. Mr. Fountain?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is, it is a very like straightforward ordinance. I think Councilman Griffin drafted a ordinance that is clear and sort of the intent of what it's doing. I think there's sort of three areas that we could talk about, and I don't know how deeply we want to get into the first area, which I would call, as an engineer trying to explain process, I guess I would call it like the bureaucratic side of an ordinance of like, how do you enforce it? How do you staff for it? How do you, what are the trigger mechanisms? What are the datums being used? I think we can probably shelve that mostly, I think, for
Right. Yeah,
today,
well,
unless we really want to get into that.
Yeah,
And I think those are all, those
Can
are
you speak
almost
to the
all relative.
conflict? Can you speak to the conflicts, Mr. Fallon?
So most of them are pretty minor. I mean, things like the mean sea level datum, we'd probably tie to like a different datum, an NAVD 88 or something like that, just from a technical perspective. It's the same idea. I think those are minor. The building code trigger, you know, most of our applications come in for their fill and do not involve building permits. They come in for road construction plans or site applications, early site packages. So technically, like, you could come do all of your fill work and then come back for your building permits later, and we wouldn't necessarily know you were going to go for building permits at the time of the fill work. So just again, that's resolvable. That's just that's something staff normally would weigh in on, right? To say, here's how you would bureaucratically fit this into our existing permitting process.
Great.
But that one's addressable. We'd have to obviously figure out enforcement and penalties if people were to go do fill. But we can certainly talk about that at a future date. I mean, obviously the easy one is saying that we wouldn't give you permits. The hard one is, well, what happens if you do something and then sell the property, or other situations like that. And then the only one that I think might bear discussion is and Councilman Griffin, I understand where you're going with the variance process. I'd probably ask the legal department to weigh in on if we could have a technical ordinance that removed like development rights with like a non-technical variance process at committee. I don't know. I don't want to speak to it because it's a little outside my area, but I'd have some concerns with that on a legal challenge. Probably. I don't know if we want to talk about that, Councilman Waring, or if we want to kind of just put that on the side as a.
Well,
item
we
for
can throw that
discussion.
out to our legal. Maybe they have to research and come back. Mr. McQueenie, or anybody, can you all touch on that?
I'm here, and I apologize because my printer's printing, so it gets loud. But so for a variance to apply, you can't really create exceptions. You'd have to do it through a variance process. And I think the language is in our Stormwater Manual or Stormwater Ordinance for what's required to grant a variance. I think it's similar to zoning. In typically a variance, I don't know, from stormwater, we need to figure out that process, because it wouldn't be a good process to go to a committee of council, because it's not really, there's no state law supporting that. And they don't, like, if you go to the planning commission, for instance, on appeal, if we get sued, the circuit court defers to the planning commission. On appeal from a public works committee decision, they would not defer to the public works committee. They would just review it and determine what they want to do. And we probably need to look at that and change it to make sure they go to the planning commission, or if it's the BZA. In zoning, it would be the BZA, but we don't have our ordinances aren't tied together in that way. So I would need to look at that for stormwater, but you could do a variance, and there are specifications for that under state law, but generally they'd go to the BZA under state law. I don't know about stormwater. There's really not a state law process for that separate from zoning.
Yeah, and Chip, I can weigh in on how we do it in the manual. So the manual looks at design exceptions, we call them, and says basically if you can do the technical justification to show that what you're doing is more protective than what is required by the manual, then that's grounds for basically a variance. But it's based, and the reason we do that is because the manual we sort of hold up as like a public health and safety document that kind of overrides zoning. So we say basically you've got to have that technical merit that shows that this is more important than like a pure vested right from a zoning perspective.
Right. You would need an independent review body in order to enjoy deference in court. They call it a quasi judicial. So the BZA, the BAR, Planning Commission, those are quasi judicial entities. They can be replaced, but they're not answerable. If the mayor calls them up, they don't have to do what the mayor tells them, or any city council member, or all of council together. They have to apply the rules as city council gives them. But if city council passes a resolution saying you should grant this permit, they should probably ignore that, honestly, because they're supposed to be judges, not employees or anything like that. So yeah, that would be the question, is how to deal with the variance process, but that could
So,
certainly be built in. That's just a change of language.
So, Mr. McQueenie, maybe we give you a little bit more time to look into that question Mr. Fountain gave you.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm happy to.
That'd be good. That'd be good. Mr. Fountain, you have some more points?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I would say the other two parts of the ordinance would be the section kind of under 6 feet, and then the section between 6 and 10 feet would be kind of my very crude categorization of items for discussion. The the Dutch dialogue report, which I think obviously is a really valuable report that we use for a lot of work that we do within the manual and within our development projects in the city. And I think Councilman Griffin's right about that, of making sure we're incorporating that into basically what we're doing and what we're regulating is high value. I think the below 6 feet section, that one's relatively straightforward. I mean, obviously the dialogues is trying to prevent areas that are going to have regular flooding. I mean, below 6 feet, you're going to see regular tidal flooding during like peak king tides, higher tides than that. You're going to see storm surge flooding. You likely are conveying water from other parts of the watershed through those sections of land. So the dialogues are pretty straightforward in saying, make a recommendation at least within those areas that they say, we should basically leave these areas alone so that water can flow through them, water can be allowed to flood them without causing harm. There always are some areas where there's questions of whether that's exactly what's happening or not. There's some coastal properties, for instance, where you see storm surge come through, and sometimes seawalls or fill can be helpful to protect those properties against that impact. But in many of the interior areas, I think there's a lot to be said for that as a area to consider. That those are important conveyances. They are areas that almost always cause challenges. We certainly did incorporate that into the Stormwater Manual, and there's basically regional modeling now within any development to say what are the impacts to upstream and downstream properties, what are you causing by displacing that flood storage. But the manual does allow you to kind of move that around within your site, where this would be more of the dialogue style approach of saying there's an ecological value to those properties as well. So that's certainly something that could be considered kind of from an ecological perspective, is something we don't have in the manual, but we do have the flood protection side in the manual. So there's a little bit of a question if we're focused solely on flooding, the Stormwater Manual probably does address that section. If we're focused on like ecological harm, there's probably something in addition to the manual that could be considered.
So right now you're speaking about properties at 6 feet elevation.
Below 6 feet, yeah, below 6 feet.
Below 6 feet.
Yeah, so the second section, and I'm just going to touch on these very quickly, we can kind of go back over it. The second section, the between 6 and 10 feet. So that's where the Dutch dialogues, and I think Councilman Griffin, I certainly want to put words in your mouth, Councilman Griffin, which I'm trying to talk about the Dutch dialogue side of it, is sort of talking about reducing development density in those areas. It says, it wants to leave more than 50% of the forest canopy in place, basically leave that natural uptake, leave those habitats. It talks about those are areas that generally will flood at least in major hurricanes and their 100-year floodplain cycle. So kind of bringing people out of that risk zone, or making them more informed buyers when they buy into those risk zones. Those are challenging areas for heavy fill development. They are. I mean, that Councilman Griffin's right about that. If you bring a lot of fill in, it's very hard to manage the offset for stormwater. Again, we have incorporated that in the new manual. Basically, if you fill, you have to show where that water is going that you've now displaced with that fill you've put in. But we only require it right now on properties that are basically 1/2 acre and larger. So that's one thing we'll talk about with the manual updates. I think at the time that was sort of a compromise, both from cost and the amount of technical work required for a development. If you're building like an individual single family home, or if you're building a small site, when the manual went through the first time, it's kind of a compromise between all the different entities. Also, there's a staffing, obviously, that it takes more people to review more proposals like that. I think that's an area that we will recommend, and that somehow needs to be regulated. Certainly, this is one way to do it. We could broaden the manual. The concern I sort of have I guess within that 6 to 10 foot range, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to talk about a lot of things and bring it all down into a narrowed focal point. But the biggest concern I have within 6 to 10 feet is that if you have it zoned for a certain density, and we say you can't fill for properties, but you can fill for roads, which is very much in keeping with what the Dutch dialogues recommend. I think what you'll still see is builders starting to potentially build out those developments with basically elevated homes and yards that flood, because they won't be able to grade. So they won't be able to have lot drainage on the lots. They'll have natural grade on the lots. They'll still deforest, which obviously causes challenges. And that's one of the things the Dutch dialogues was against. But what you'll see is a lot of people building elevated homes on lots that don't drain. I think there's a lot to be said for that from a water protection of surrounding properties. You would reduce risk to upstream and downstream properties from that kind of approach, because you're still able to store water on the property and convey water through the property. I think there is a challenge with property owner expectations that they feel like their yard should drain. I think we've all seen that over the last few years, right? As people's yards have become a lot wetter from the increasing rain intensities. That I think will generate a lot of frustration from people who buy those properties, not understanding that their yard is likely to be somewhat, I mean, if you've gone outside the last week and walked around on any yards, like that's what your yard would be like from, September through March or April, because you wouldn't have the transpiration, uptake. So that is a concern if they go that route. I'm not saying builders will, but that's one option if they still want to build through that existing intensity. I think what the dialogues we're hoping to see is a reduction in units basically being built on a property, so that those units were being built on the high value, like higher land components of the property, and then those lower areas were left wet and natural, whether it's forested, and in Johns Island it's mostly forested, but you'll see some old agricultural fields, and kind of let those areas be wet. Kind of honestly what I think we've been trying to figure out a way to put together with the new cluster zoning or the conservation zoning. It's almost the conservation zoning on steroids, where it's basically saying not only do you have to have open space, you have to have untouched, native forest or semi-native forest for most of Johns Island on those properties to continue uptaking that water and storing that water and acting as wetlands and sponges. And there's a lot of value to that. I mean, I think there's if you're looking at it from a pure flooding ecological standpoint, there's a lot of value to having those unimpacted areas on the low wet portions of properties. I mean, that's something that you can, and I think, Councilman Griffin has kind of the front row seat in Church Creek, that Church Creek is sort of what happens if you eventually fill in all of those low lying areas and build homes in them, right? I mean, you basically have flooding that is very, very hard to fix because it's so systemic across the watershed. And I think there's a lot to be said to trying to prevent that from happening on Johns Island, and minimizing any future impacts, obviously, in the rest of the city as well. So that's where I'm trying to figure out how to adjust or how to look at it. That I think what we're trying to do is say, it's not just fill, right? It's sort of saying that we want to somehow focus development into the better parts of a site and a region, while leaving the kind of native vegetation in place, which does a lot in our area for both storage and water uptake, but also not basically putting people into the flooded areas, because I think that's something that we'd like to get there. I think that's something that we as a society in a low country region, I think that's what we used to be. And you see that in kind of the areas around New Orleans too, like the bayou areas and things, right? That people kind of used to living with water. But I don't know that we've gotten to a point where that's a service standard that the residents who move into Johns Island are ready for, to say that you will be very wet most of the year. And that's one of my concerns, is that it'll create a lot of project requests very quickly for us to come find ways to dry that out. So those are kind of my initial points. I think there's a lot to be said for the under 6 feet, trying to find a way to protect that conveyance, protect those wetlands, protect that storage. It's almost all areas that are activated today with water frequently. I think the 6 to 10 feet definitely accounts for sea level rise, climate change, hurricane impact. It is an ecologically sensitive zone, but I would almost prefer, I mean, from a pure flooding standpoint, I would like to see some way to again, cluster that development into the better parts of those properties, and the lower parts be left without fill and without impact. I don't know if there's a way to do like a percentage of the property that could be filled versus a percentage that can't be filled, or if there's a percentage that you have to leave X amount untouched in order to get filled. I mean, there's lots of different ways to look at this, or we can look at it through the comp plan process and kind of say, is there a zoning approach to take that same view and say, with the water, kind of the water study that's been done, water study work that's been done with the comp plan, can we take these really sensitive elevation areas and consider a way to, again, focus that development into the better parts of those areas and away from those low-lying damaged areas? So I think there is real validity to that as a concern of filling and impacting all those low-lying areas.
And right now, you're talking about the 6 to 10 foot elevations.
Yes, correct.
Okay, well, I think that's a very good point.
And if I was going to throw one more thing in, Councilman, if I
Okay,
had to
good.
make a separate request, almost from, which I think is in keeping with Councilman Griffin's statement and something we've been looking at, really in the floodplain side of our department as much as the stormwater department, is there is some real, I think, benefit to considering, especially that 6 to 10 foot and obviously the below 6 foot area, removing the option to build slab on grade housing as a foundation type within those areas, because that's where we see we're kind of almost incentivizing the additional fill to come up to grade with slab on grade housing versus doing a crawl space or an elevated structure. You're reducing the eventual resiliency. I think Councilman Warren, you brought that up a number of times of how difficult it is to raise slab on grade houses in the future,
Right.
if it ever becomes a challenge.
Right.
And you lose, one of the advantages we have in the low country is everything is so flat generally that each vertical inch the water goes up, it spreads out a lot. So you get a lot of extra storage capacity. So when you add in that little bit of extra space with the crawl space, something like that, you really add a lot of extra storage capacity for that water in a hurricane or in a major event. And yes, it's inconvenient, and we certainly don't want people to lose their cars that are parked in the driveway and things, but it's a lot better than having a foot of water in your house, to have some of that water in your crawl space or in a garage potentially.
Okay, so if you were to summarize your 4 key points, I give below 6 feet, some merit, 6 to 10 feet, you cluster on the better parts of the property, maybe a certain percentage through zoning, getting back to Councilman Appel's point. And then, I don't know, maybe fill a certain percentage or not. I'm just going off your point.
Mhm.
Those are 2 that I got. 3 and 4 would be what?
Would be the concern about the variance language, which I think Mr. McQueen
Slab,
was
okay,
saying
right.
he would look into. And then the last one, I guess, would be the potential for eliminating slab on grade construction. You could do that within the floodplain in general, really. I mean, that's almost one way to consider, or you could do it within elevation zones. Either one would be worth considering, I think.
I agree. Now, Councilman Appel.
Yeah, thanks again, Matt, for that very thorough explanation. I mean, I think that the concept here, the goal that we're trying to achieve is simple, but the mechanism to accomplish it cannot be a one-page ordinance. It just is not that simple, unfortunately. I wish it was. But a couple other things to think about as we continue to work through this very important discussion is, we've talked a lot about future development. We want to stop future development that's poor in the wrong places, et cetera. What about all the people that are currently living in houses that arguably were pretty poor developments to begin with? So let's say, Hurricane James comes through this fall, God forbid, wipes out, floods out, 100% losses, entire swaths of neighborhoods in the basin, over in that Church Creek Basin. Okay, so now under current FEMA flood regs and just our own zoning regs and our own updated stormwater manual, you could get yourself into a situation where neighborhoods aren't allowed to be even rebuilt, potentially. And you get a homeowner's insurance. We got to talk to Kevin about this, but I can promise you there's going to be some problems on that front as well. So when you make this apply so broadly to all ecological areas, not just new development, you can create some very, very adverse impacts for existing homeowners, existing citizens of the city of Charleston, existing voters and taxpayers, and all these situations. So we got to be very careful about that, and to the extent to which an ordinance like this, as applied to that sort of scenario, could amount to a taking under the Amendment of the United States Constitution. And I mean, that's what we're talking about here when you have a regulation on the books that prevents any use of your property. So there's a lot of complicated issues here that we need to address. But that being said, that doesn't mean we shy away from it and ignore this for the next 12 months. And I don't think we've been ignoring it. I actually think we've been stepping it up, certainly since I've been on council with the new Stormwater Manual. And I can promise you a lot of those developments that are sitting in Church Creek right now that are not probably the wisest decisions in the world wouldn't be allowed today if they were to come through the door under our new Stormwater Manual as it exists today. So I think we just got to be very careful about this. But again, I kept hearing over and over in Matt's discussion here. I think, frankly, we're putting too much of this conversation on Matt and on Kinsey and his department. If we want to stop homes from being located in certain parts of the city, then we need to step up to the plate from a zoning perspective and do that. And Harry, I'm going to just tell you, we're talking about downzoning properties by the hundreds, if not thousands. You're talking about the government coming in and saying to huge swaths of homeowners, we're not letting you develop here. That is massive government regulation into development rights and Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment issues here. And I'm not saying I'm against it. I think that a case can be made for doing that, but that is how you address this issue front on, head on, not through a technical code requirement, through a very specific development technique. And as the mayor said, sometimes fill is no problem. Fill is not inherently bad. Fill is a tool that can be used poorly in certain contexts. But if we don't want to see homes built in certain ecological areas, we need to define where those ecological areas are, and we need to be upfront about downzoning and taking away development rights from those property owners, because that's what we're talking about. That's the upfront conversation we need to be having. And again, I'm not saying I'm against that. I think it's, if there's ever a justification for the city to exercise its zoning and police powers, it's for an issue like this that we all know all too well from our personal experiences and from our constituents' experiences. And we certainly have the record that we've built over this last several years, whether it be the Dutch dialogues and all these different studies we've done to substantiate and defend such aggressive government regulation in court if we're ever challenged on that. And I think we need to have the stomach to do that if we're going to take some of these aggressive actions. But I just want to be very clear what we're talking about here. We're talking about taking away property rights. We're talking about downzoning property. We're talking about almost certainly facing lawsuits from folks that like to sue governments for takings and inverse condemnation and all those different kinds of things. And I just want us to all be clear about what we're getting into. But again, very important discussion. We need to prevent bad development from happening in bad places. We just got to go about it in the smartest way possible that doesn't incur massive financial liability to the city, that doesn't negatively and adversely impact existing property owners, I assume, want to keep living in their house, and other such unintended consequences of this. So, but again, very important discussion, and I think this is a very worthwhile conversation to be having.
Councilman Appel, don't go on mute yet. When you go back to the issues of existing communities, believe it or not, that's one that the mayor and this council, it should have been here 2 years ago. We went through that quite a bit because at one time our ordinance would take the assessed value to determine whether you 50% of damage or above it. Obviously, work with the mayor, got with the auditor and all. And now we use the actual market value. And if the people disagree with that, and it was through hard conversations just like this we're having right now, then they can go and get their own appraisal. If the appraisal is higher, then that 50% threshold is even hopefully harder to meet in the event of a catastrophic event. Because you're talking about a hurricane, but shoot, if a tree falls through somebody's house, not because of a hurricane, it just got rotted and just fell through the middle of it. It could happen. But that said, if these existing houses, and you're right, were built in sensitive ecological zones, would they be ecological sensitive now that they've been paved over and all of that in your way of thinking? Would they not be considered because they've been bulldozed and asphalted and concrete? Not it's one thing if you want to return it to being ecological, but would that be considered an ecological zone if that were included in our ordinance? But my point is, we got some very, very good points going on right now, and I don't want to lose to say we had a good conversation and no action steps. I think that would be a travesty if we did that on this. So the pathway forward, I know Mr. McQuinney is going to think up something. Look at that question that Mr. Fountain gave him. Mr. Fountain's going to look at his 4 points. Somehow we need to incorporate zoning into this as well, Councilmember Appel. And I know I'm thinking about something else. I'm forgetting something else, but that comprehensive approach, I would think would be the answer on this one. As you said, not just one ordinance, but any other input from others on this, Mr. Mayor or Councilmember Shaheen?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to ask Mr. Fountain to clarify something. I hope I didn't misunderstand him on one point. But if you're not allowed to fill in a particular piece of property, I think you mentioned that you perhaps could still build, but you build up. Did I hear that correctly?
So that somewhat depends on how we define fill, I think, within the ordinance. If you define fill as being any material brought from offsite, then obviously building materials would be included in fill. So you wouldn't be able to build the foundation or the piles. At that point, and man, Chip will probably tell us to go in executive session at that point. I mean, at that point, I think there's a concern that you've made a property undevelopable completely. I think if we, I don't think that was the intent. I think the intent was for site fill, for mass site fill. If we're saying that we would allow, foundation footings, piers, pilings, then, in theory, you could still, as long as you elevate your home above flood elevation, we don't really have much in the way of code requirements that would say you can't have your yard be wet. You can't have your driveway or garage potentially be flooded. And that's similar to what you would see in like a beach community, right? You would see the homes go up and the yards and properties would just flood every time there was a really significant storm. Some of our beaches have a little bit better soils and things. We don't see that as much here, but that's not an unusual. Florida Keys kind of have been a good example of that lately with some of the sea level rise events they've had. That is a way to build. It doesn't bring in much fill. It does save that storage and that conveyance, but it would let you have density.
Okay. Councilman.
Clarification on that.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Griffin, I'm gonna circle back to you. We've had some good conversation here. You want this to move forward as a motion of council, or do you want this discussion to move forward? And then we can come back and work. Because I think council would benefit from hearing what Mr. Fountain said and what Mr. McQueen said and what Councilman Appel. We've had a very good discussion on a very difficult subject, and we got some action steps that, once our people have a chance to research, and that could lead to some substantive changes. But so how you want to move forward on this? Because I think Councilman Brady would like to have something to say on this. I don't know, Councilman Shealy would like to have something to say on this. And I promise at tomorrow's meeting with their input, we've had our chance to input. Hopefully we'll let others on council have a chance to have input on this at tomorrow's reporting out of this issue. So what's your pleasure? You want
well, regardless of what the vote is on the ordinance itself, I mean, we're going to report it regardless. And
right, we're going to report it out, but I mean,
if it fails, it's just the first reading. So then you just go back to the drawing board and try to come up with something else. So,
okay. Well, I guess my point is, if it fails, what I want is this work on some of the points you brought up to continue.
Well, I mean, then that means it can't just be me, because I mean, I brought up the ordinance 2 years ago and then it sat deferred for a long, long time. And now
so what I meant was some of this would be as amendments, for example, to the stormwater drain. Stormwater.
Listen, I think that if there's a better way to do it, let's do it. But, I just can't sit back for the whole length of
I get that.
about it. So I just had to bring it back up. I mean, I'm getting ready to finish off my 4th year on council, and it's something that's been coming out of my mouth since day one. So I had to bring it back up.
I get that. So we're bringing it back up. What I want to do is just want to have a good conversation, a big hullabaloo, and then 3 months from now we right where we are today. That was my point. In other words,
Well, maybe we have it as a item that comes up at quarterly or bi-monthly or something like that. Updates from the Stormwater Manual or anything that we want to bring up to potentially tie into the Stormwater Manual.
I guess let me finish my thought. If this conversation goes forward to council, which it will, because when we report it will, 1 or 2 council members or 3 may come up with some points weren't brought up today, which will give Mr. Fountain, what will give Mr. McQueenie, our planning people, a little bit more information to come back to this same Public Works Committee with something more specific that can be hopefully discussed and implemented. That's my point. Because what I don't want to do is have an up or down vote and then boom, it ends right there. Because net 4 years later, if we don't get some updates on the below 6 feet, the idea about clustering on the better part of the property from 6 to 10 feet, I mean, that really made a lot of sense. Building on a slab going forward, do we want to really do that when houses raising, we know sea level is rising, and I've never seen a house on a slab raise. I'm sure with enough money, engineering can accomplish most things. But, I mean, those are some pretty good points right now that I guess this ordinance doesn't really, in the current form, address.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Just so we're all on the same page here, the Dutch Dialogue Charleston report does not say that in the ecological zone you can cluster. It says that you can build roads, but that's the only exception listed under their report under the ecological zone. In the transition zone, that's when the clustering comes into play. So I think that we all probably need to go back and go through that report again. And in the grand scheme of things, I think we need to decide, is this, when this report came to council, I felt like our stormwater department was endorsing this. We took a vote on it. If there are things that we don't agree with as a city, we need to address that.
That's my point. Yeah.
We're looking at a report. We're bringing in Wagner and Ball. We're bringing in the Water Institute of the Gulf. They're coming in and they're helping us with all of these other projects. And we've got this Dutch Dialogue report out there that they reference quite often. We need to have a discussion at some point, sooner rather than later. Are there discrepancies that we don't support as a city? And how do we hash those out? Because we can't have this limbo of, we've got this report out here that we've taken a vote on as a council to endorse this. And there may be things that we don't necessarily agree with as a city. So that's, I think, where my frustration is.
Okay, well,
as I wrote this thing, I'm thinking, okay, we put so much time and effort and money into this report, but if we have issues internally that there are things that we need to get to the bottom of, I'm happy to take a step back and give our staff enough time to do that.
okay.
But my other point is, with the Stormwater Manual, back in 19, I brought this thing up. We wanted to wait till the manual came out. We're saying that there may or may not be things that are in this that could be a benefit and may not be a benefit, or may make sense and may not make sense. So like you, Councilmember Waring, I don't know where we go from here. I really have no idea, because I certainly don't want to keep bringing stuff up that may be counterproductive, but I don't really know what we want to do. Do we want to use the Dutch Dialogue as our document, or are we trying to do a mix of a few different things? I really don't know what we're trying to do. I think Councilmember Bell said this is part of our job as a city council, as council people, to bring these things up and maybe write some ordinances and try to get some legislation passed. But I don't really know where I'm supposed to be working off of. I thought it was the Dutch Dialogue report, but here today I'm hearing that there are some things that we don't necessarily agree with.
Okay. All right, let me do this. Mr. Mayor?
So this may take me a few thoughts to get out. And Councilmember Griffin, I appreciate all your reference and support now of the tenants, the ideas that were put forth in the Dutch dialogues, and glad you are so affirmative about that now. I mean, you mentioned how much money it cost us to do that study. I think I helped raise half of the money outside of the city to pay for the report and the effort. At the time, I don't recall that you supported it at that time, but be that as it may, and I appreciate your effort also, to try to put things simply, when Albert Einstein came up with his theory of relativity as E equals mc squared, it's like, gee, it's too simple, for such a complicated matter as describing energy in the universe. But he figured that out. And we have a complicated system, as I think Councilmember Appel did a much better job of describing than me. But back to the Dutch dialogues, we have been using the report, Councilmember, to inform our policy going forward. And admittedly, the report is more like, as they say in the Pirates of the Caribbean, a guideline rather than a strict, you got to do this, that, and the other. And Phil is a great example. When I was in the Netherlands before we brought them back over here, I mean, there are many cases in the Netherlands that the government and the development community supported Phil in certain places where it made sense and where it was properly organized and planned. Our own Stormwater Manual was informed by ideas, principles from our Dutch dialogues. Our Church Creek authority that you serve on, I mean, we kind of shifted gear as to the future projects that we plan now to pursue based upon the principles that were put forward in the Dutch Dialogue report. Many of the things that we've been working on, the projects, the comprehensive plan update that's coming forward in the next couple of months, again, is fully informed and guided by the principles of our Dutch Dialogue's effort. So to say that we're not doing anything or that they haven't informed us is just not so. Now, a plan going forward, I feel like, y'all, we're doing that. Next week, our Community Development Committee will have the Conservation Ordinance presented to us. We've been discussing that here today. As that's brought forward, we can make appropriate suggestions and input to that ordinance going forward. Next on our agenda, as I mentioned, is Mr. Fountain's report on the Stormwater Manual. We agreed when we put it in place that we would come back and review how we could improve it going forward. Again, many of the things that are in the manual address Phil specifically, and the principles of the Dutch dialogues. Can it be better? Yeah, that's why we review after a certain amount of time. The comprehensive plan, as I've already mentioned, has a complete report. It's really amazing, by the same team, the Water Institute and by Wagner and Ball, that talks about this as a citywide issue, not just in these two areas. So through the Stormwater Manual, through the comprehensive plan, through building requirements that could be informed by all of these discussions, through the Conservation Ordinance coming forward, those are all definitive action steps that we are taking as a city and have been engaged in some time to address these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
May I clarify something, please, Mr.
Sure, Councilman.
Mr. Mayor, you made mention that I didn't support the authorization of the Dutch Dialogue study. Just to clarify that, I've never questioned the capabilities of the Water Institute of the Gulf, Wagner and Ball, or anybody involved. The first time I ever heard them speak over at Dock Street Theater, I was blown away. I voted against that at the time, allocating that fund for just this reason. that I felt that we were going to have another study and not enough action. So that is my fear. That's why I continue to bring it up. I just didn't think it would be a good idea to spend more money and then have a great document on a shelf that we weren't necessarily going to use. So all I'm doing here today is hoping that we can find a way to use this. I didn't know it was just a guideline. I thought that we endorsed it and that it was something that we were going to be using quite often. But I think, Mr. Chairman, the only way that we're going to be able to allow the rest of council to see this at least is to take a vote on it. Because if we can report it, that's fine. But if we just shelve it.
No. This is going to go forward as a discussion at least. I'm
Right.
going to, it's that important to take a vote on whether we move forward or not. I would love to have this. This has been so constructive. I don't want to lose the constructive aspects of the conversation that's been held here today. And the mayor's right. Our manual can be improved. Our policies can be improved. That's what you're after. Okay. So what I'd like to do is carry the discussion forward. If you want to have a vote, I'll certainly call for a motion to carry the vote. I'm going to interrupt myself and recognize Councilmember Appel.
I promise to be brief on this. Here's another thing. We all have our different thoughts about what being a city council member means, what being a legislative, publicly elected official means. It's my view that we're here to set policy at a 10,000 foot level. We're not here to start getting into technical manuals and start splitting hairs. That's not our job. That's not our expertise. We set general goals, general policies, general frameworks, general priorities, and then we turn that over to our professional staff, our legal staff, our planning staff, our stormwater staff to get into those weeds and to produce those results. I just want to, as we continue this discussion, it's not necessarily our role and our best use of time and our best use of our capabilities to really start getting into the weeds and into the details here, because we're not stormwater engineers, we're not hydrologists. It's on some level, all we can do is sort of hit these issues from a very high level and have our staff take over, and of course, periodically check in and see how everything is doing. And I think we've been doing a whole lot, as the mayor said. I mean, to say that we're not doing anything with respect to the Dutch dialogues is just not true. I mean, and it's common, frankly, for planning documents to be put together and not everything be done at once. In fact, I'd be willing to say that in the universe of planning documents that are put together by consultants, the Dutch dialogues has already been used far more than most. I mean, probably in the 99th percentile of, nice, pretty picture documents that don't just sit up on a shelf. So just wanted to throw that additional
let's
comment out there.
I agree with you, Councilman Appel, with one exception. We have the high view. We depend on our expert professionals to come back, but they do report the specifics back to us so we can vote them so they can be implemented. So, Mr. Fountain.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just one point I should have mentioned earlier. It's more focused geographically than citywide, but we do. One of the things we did take from the Dutch dialogue on Johns Island was we have worked, and we've reported on this a few times at committee, but I know we have a long list of reports. So sometimes it gets lost until we get to construction level. We do have the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant work on Johns Island with the basically with W.K. Dixon Biohabitats and Water Institute of the Gulf, where we're sort of complementing some of the work that's being done in the comp plan on the Johns Island basically flood study, where we are taking a look at where are these regional flow paths, where are the wetlands on the island, basically how does conveyance work, so we can say how do we need to preserve these features and make sure they're being accounted for by design professionals as they come in with new permits. So that's something, at least for that one region, which certainly again is not citywide, but one region that we have advanced that work, and we're continuing to try to drive towards how to incorporate that into a planning document and into technical review.
All right, good. Okay, we had a lot of input on this one, so we bring it to close. It was a pleasure to the committee. We carry it forward as a discussion, or we're gonna carry it forward as a motion.
I'd like to carry it forward as a motion, and then, if it fails, and we'll bring
Okay,
forward it, and if it doesn't, then we'll go back to the drawing board, but I'm never going to quit trying. I definitely a lot of work that can be done, but I would hope that we could have a robust discussion at council tomorrow night.
we will have that. Councilman Shea.
I'm just wondering, Mr. Chairman, I've following what the mayor has said and Councilman Rappel's follow-up conversation with all this. And this sounds like we need more work done to this thing. And I mean, we can report it out to full council tomorrow. Councilman Griffin mentioned something earlier that I had to go back and just rethink. We've already passed this as from our first reading? What is really the status of this ordinance?
He withdrew it and then he brought it back again through the committee. Okay, so he withdrew that first, the ordinance that was the first reading. And that's how it's on our agenda today. He brought it back. So,
if we can get, I'm just wondering about the legal ramifications of this. If it had been passed at first reading, what really is this? Do we have to bring it back up for another first
I
reading?
withdrew that.
yeah, he withdrew that. So
Completely
that
and
we
started
all over
completely
again.
over.
Yeah, we're starting all over again, Councilman. That's all that is.
Well, it sounds, but then it sounds like from Mr. McQueenie and Mr. Fountain, they need more input on this thing. So it may be just best to defer it. And
No, we need to go forward so others from council can, I think we should go forward as a discussion. Either way, we're going to have the discussion at council tomorrow. I do believe you're going to have some more input from other council members living in sensitive areas. I would think, I hadn't talked to him, but I would think Councilman Brady would have something to say about it.
Yeah, and I heard you comment about that, Councilman Shealy and Councilmember Brady.
Correct. I think we're going to have the discussion, and I think out of that discussion, maybe we'll get 1 or 2 points for our people to come back to us and report at this committee at a future date, if not the next meeting. So, is that a motion on your part? I want to move this along. Is that a motion on your part, Councilman Griffin?
Yes, sir.
To move it as to approve the ordinance, or to move it forward as a discussion?
I mean, if we can do that, then that's fine. If I don't know, it's on the agenda. It's listed as an ordinance. If we can move the discussion on without taking any action, yeah, sure, we can do it like that.
Well, why don't we do that? We take a motion to move it on as a discussion. Is that your motion?
Yes.
Okay. Do we have a second for that?
I'll second.
Second it. Any more discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay. All right. I'm telling you, man, we don't need to lose the good aspects of discussion we had here today. It'd be a failing on our part if we come back not having done something as a result. Mr. Fountain, I know we're supposed to discuss the updated stormwater design, but if that was as a result of this, can we push that into the next meeting? And I'll tell you why. Because after we get some more input from council tomorrow on this very thought, then maybe it would be great to come back and then have that update on the manual.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, just very briefly, this was just intended to be setting out what procedure we want to follow to bring the manual back. When council had passed the manual in July, they had asked us to basically sort of take it for a test drive and implement it for 6 months or so, and then try to come up with a process to bring it back.
We sure did. So you have go ahead, Mr. Fountain.
And I don't think we. You're right, Mr. Chairman. I don't think we need to get into the substance of the update at this point, because I think there is still a lot of information to gather. I just wanted to, I guess, make a recommendation and then get some opinion from the committee. My original thoughts were that we would basically have this discussion, let full council know as well that we are gathering information and input from council members related to the stormwater manual, anything they've had from their constituents that they want to make sure we're addressing. Certainly, I have a lot of that already from the last 6 months of discussions with council members on projects. We would take that information, reconvene the stakeholder task force that we did with the manual, which we've kind of kept that group loosely together.
Good.
Discuss those items as well as any items that the task force members have that they would like to weigh in on, since we have a pretty broad group of members on that, obviously as a stakeholder group. And then sort of take that task force recommendation and information back as a report out to Public Works Utilities Committee to say, here's kind of what the opinions were from the task force. I don't think we're going to get a consensus out of the task force. I mean, it's very different interest groups. but sort of here are opinions, here are things they've liked and not liked, here are recommendations they have for changes. And then at that time, have that discussion in more detail at Public Works Utilities, Mr.
That's
Chairman,
great.
to see what we'd want to look at updating with the manual.
Great thinking on it. Thank you for keeping that task force together, because it was a good task force that you all put together on that.
But I'll certainly give the task force at least a month or so to make sure we have time to gather before we convene it, to make sure we have time to gather any input from council members, as well as any other information that comes up related to Councilman Griffin's ordinance with the fill restrictions.
All
And
right.
then we can look at reconvening them probably in April with the intent to come back to Public Works Utilities Committee maybe in May or June with those recommendations.
So let's try to hold it to May. I don't want to get too far into the year.
And we can go sooner. I mean, I'm trying to balance. I want to make sure we get the input, but we can try to go faster.
Definitely
we
want
don't.
the input. Definitely want the input. No doubt.
I mean, certainly from my standpoint, we've mentioned it briefly. I mean, I do have some, from a staff concern, we have some concerns with some of the smaller sites that I think we're still seeing issues with fill. That there really isn't much restriction on them, and that's something we do need to address that wasn't really taken into account in the original manual. And I'm sure other people have other suggestions in addition to that. So,
okay, all right. Thank you on that. Now on the item 3, I asked to put this on, and I did speak with Amy, our CFO, Ms. Wharton, and she had some numbers to come forward, but really to tie the TIF accounts to the actual project. It would be better if we gave her a little more time. So if it's okay with you all, I asked her to, if she could bring that forward at the next meeting, which would be 2 weeks from now. Okay. We'll get the TIF balances and all the TIFs across the city, and how much money is being allocated from one TIF account to different drainage projects around the city. Thought that would be great information for all of us to have, and a little bit more time for her to report that accurately would make a whole lot more sense. So if that's okay, by acclamation, I hope we can defer that discussion and move forward to item 4, which is a 2021 small project allocation. Now, Mr. Fountain.
sorry, Mr. Chairman, I know we had sort of, I think, a few items with Ms. Wharton, one of which was the drainage fund account discussions itself within the allocation, where you look, and the only reason I had mentioned that was there was some connection between that and how the small project allocations work, because we've in the past we've somewhat filled in maybe gaps in the drainage fund account using the small project for conceptual study work on projects. So I just wanted to see if we wanted to talk, and certainly Ms. Wharton, feel free to weigh in on that, but if we want to just briefly go through where the existing allocations are for the drainage fund, not how do we reallocate or where do we input future monies, but kind of what has already been funded and budgeted and allocated by council in the past, before we kind of touch base.
Well, Mr. Fountain, anytime you and Ms. Wharton's got great information to break forward, who am I to stand in the way? So go ahead.
I think we can go through and do the TIF stuff at the next meeting.
Okay, all right. Ms. Wharton, you're up.
Okay, can everybody see this okay?
Yeah, I can. I hope everybody else can.
Okay. So these are the current project allocations that we have in the drainage fund. We have forest acres, and I just put each type of funding source with it to show you all the different funding sources. I'll have a summary of that towards that end as well. So you can see the majority of this is funded by the stormwater bond. And total cost is 18.5 million, but we've already spent a lot of that. So about 5.5 million is remaining over the next 3 years. Does that make sense?
No, go over that again. I didn't catch that.
Total project budget for forest acres was 18.5 million.
Okay.
Those are all the funding sources that we had for that project: drainage, stormwater bond, local option permit income, which is really mini bottle. And then we had just a little bit of miscellaneous.
Okay.
And we're well into that project. So a lot of that project budget has already been spent. So we have about 5.5 million in remaining costs.
All right.
That will be spent over the next 3 years.
Okay.
And then Market Street, 17.5 million. It's projected to start in 2023. The majority of that funding comes from the stormwater bond. And then we'll have the Market Street streetscape in this as well, because they kind of are a package deal together. And right now that has a funding shortage of almost $4.3 million that we'll have to address. But
Was
again,
that the 2012 stormwater bond?
yes. And none of the streetscape portion will be drainage funds at all. It's just, they're tied together. So I had them both in there. They're mostly tourism funds that we're using for that.
Okay.
And then September Clark, as you can see now, since we got the STIB money, we no longer are using any drainage fund money for either phase 4 or phase 5. So that did free up. We're using almost $56 million in infrastructure bank and King Street Gateway TIF, and then state infrastructure bank and King Street Gateway TIF for phase 5.
I want to say a collective hallelujah on that. Thank you.
Yes. Then Church Creek, Nifwif, very long project name, renaturalization, habitat restoration, and flood protection project. That is estimated at 3.95 million with almost 2.5 in drainage funds and the remaining in a Nifwif grant. It's expected to be expended over the next 3 years from 21 to 2023. Barbary Woods is 7.1 million. That is all the drainage fund. We've already.
Wait, can we go back to Church Creek?
Yes.
So we got slightly less than 4 million. Mr. Fountain, do we have any answers on, I guess, the long-term fix yet? Whether we're going to need a pump or extra drainage ditches, or what's the answer on that?
It's a good question, Mr. Chairman. So what we've been working on is sort of the action plan for implementing the Dutch Dialogues approach in Church Creek, which is basically due to be finished in mid to late April. The initial work, the kind of best bang for your buck incremental fix work, has been adding storage, basically flood storage, and that's what the NIFWIF grant is for, is to basically obtain low-lying property, remove soils from those low-lying properties, be able to store more water in places we want to store it rather than on people's properties and in their roads and in their houses, which is kind of where it sits now during major storm events. There's certainly going to be more work than this needed in the basin to bring it up to a level of service that we want to accomplish. We're very hopeful that the TIF in that area, and that's where I think Ms. Wharton will probably talk about that a little bit in a couple of weeks, that the TIF starts to generate revenue and starts to be able to basically be used to pay for some of those improvements in this area, since that was kind of the hope with, I think, setting up that TIF for stormwater purposes. But yes, we'll basically be looking at these larger acquisitions. We'll have probably a series of recommendations for green infrastructure and right-of-ways. We're actually looking at some options to divert portions of the basin out into other areas through like Highway 61, do some other improvements. And the pump station is still an approach that could benefit the basin. That one is more of a cost benefit consideration issue that you're probably looking at somewhere on the order of 10 years, probably 5 to 10 years is an absolute minimum for design and permitting for something along those lines. And depending what scale you build it at, somewhere between $30 and $50 million. So it's just something we haven't advanced aggressively, and that we're trying to find things we know we have funding to be able to build and create some short-term improvements for flood situations in the basin.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Chairman?
Councilman Griffin?
Yes, sir. Let me just ask a question real quick about the drainage fund money. Was this money that was allocated before we started looking at phase 4 Spring Fishburne, or is this money that became available by us getting the state funds, the more allocation from the SIB on that money?
So and Ms. Warren, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to take it?
Go ahead.
Sure. So the Spring Fishburne money the Church Creek money had been set aside before the STIB money was the most recent round of STIB money. Of course, there's two different allocations, right. But before the most recent round of STIB money, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant money is also, I believe we actually got the original notifications prior to the most recent
right.
infrastructure bank.
The reason I asked that is because we're talking about having such limited amount of resources in the drainage fund, having to deplete it because we had run out of money in a lot of ways on Spring Fishburne. So having some of that money free up, I'm just trying to figure out whether or not this money was that money or whether this was separate money.
Sure. And I think Ms. Horton's going to cover that at the end, what the
Okay.
current status of the drainage fund is based on freeing up some of the money from the infrastructure bank and some of these other grants that we've acquired as well. So it's a good question, Councilman.
Thank you.
All right.
Barberry Woods, all drainage fund. We're hopeful for some NIFWIF grant money on this one, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Johns Island, the NIFWIF Johns Island Restoration Plan. This is just master plan services. It's not anything more than that. That's 235 with half and half grant and drainage fund. And then the FEMA, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm okay. I said, okay, that's all. Yeah.
FEMA buyouts, we just have a little bit of expense left match. This is a match to all the buyouts, the home buyouts, and we have that in 2021. We just have a little bit more on that, and then we'll be done with the FEMA buyout money, or grant match, I should say.
Is that for the latest round of buyouts? The 2000 and Matt, do you remember what year that is? It's 16 or 17?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what it's
yeah.
for.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Thank you.
It's not any new buyouts. This is the
Yeah.
last bit of money we had to for that last round that we got.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And then Windermere is 4.5, and that is all drainage fund.
Mr. Fountain, does that include the second outfall?
Yeah, so this funding is the project that, at least conceptually at this point, includes that second outfall behind the school.
All right, thank you.
So just real quick, if y'all don't mind, I just took a screenshot on my iPad of this slide. I'm going to save it just for a rainy day, just to, I love seeing this, and I appreciate all the hard work on this. Thanks.
We all do. All right.
And then Hugie Street is about $12 million. 8.5 of that is out of the drainage fund. We have a small grant, the SCRIA grant, 1.1 in Cooper River Bridge TIP, and then CWS reimbursement, and just a little bit of stormwater small project funding in that.
I didn't realize this, Mr. Fountain had gotten up as high as 12 million. I believe for some reason.
Mr. Chairman, there's a reason that some of these projects haven't been built yet, is that they are, many of them are challenging, difficult projects. The original phase, the first phase of this project, we're sitting more at the roughly $5 million.
Right,
number,
that's the
but
number
this-
I had, right.
Yeah,
right.
so this includes the pump station component, this is the estimate of that pump station and the construction of the new outfall into New Market Creek, and all the work associated with that as well is in this number.
Excuse me, question.
Council, yeah, I can't see everybody, so speak up.
Yes,
Councilman
sir.
Griffin, uh-huh.
Remind me, I know we just approved this money, some of it, just recently, I think at the last meeting.
Right, right.
Wasn't there some alternatives that we may actually get some more money back, maybe from CWS and,
I think that's already in there, the 1.856.
right, but I thought it said there was an additional million or something like that, or am I thinking of a different project?
I think you're thinking of something else.
I think that was a seawall, right?
Oh,
Matt?
yes, that's right.
Yes, yeah, the low battery also had $1 million.
That's
of
right.
CWS.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, we do have some potential on this one. We're certainly optimistic, potentially for another RIA grant or another grant opportunity on King Uji. We wanted to make sure we have funding before we started building things on the project. So that's why it's got the allocation that it does.
Is there any chance that we could maybe take any more money out of the TIF, or that's pretty much maxed out?
The first borrowing that we did, the $12 million, that's all allocated, but we are looking to do another borrowing this year where we could shift some of that from TIF, from the drainage fund to the TIF.
So there's some options there. I
There's
thought
some options, that's right.
Perfect.
Well, let me
Thank
ask this question for Mr. Mayor, I guess Mr. Fountain too. Mr. Mayor, remember, I know we took out of that 2.3 or 2.4 that was remaining from the bridge project. We took $1 million out, I believe, for affordable housing. Remember, it was supposed to be for streetscapes, and I thought drainage. If anything's left there, can we put that towards this drainage?
Well, those remaining funds were left in the Hugie Streetscape project, which kind of dovetails with this one.
Okay, all right.
It goes right up to the other side of the railroad tracks, I believe.
I got you.
And so ideally, they should both get done, and you fix the drainage and improve the streets
Right.
all the way from King over to Morrison Drive.
I
So
follow. I follow.
that money is still there, and Councilmember Griffin already asked a question, but I was going to offer that in that Cooper River bridgette.
I know, I thought I fixed that. I guess I didn't, sorry.
We could allocate some more funds to this project and then save $1 million or $2 million from the drainage fund for some other project.
That's why I was headed. Thank you, sir. All right.
Yes, sir.
All right, Ms. Wharton?
Okay, so then we have the Concourse Street Pump Station retrofit, $6 million. That would be all drainage fund.
Okay.
Then Cooper Jackson drainage improvements, we have 1 million in drainage fund and almost 2.8 million in Cooper River Bridge TIF funding.
Mr. Fountain, on this one, I thought, I heard some information where it was to fix this whole deal was going to be something like 20 or 25 million, this Cooper Jackson drainage basin.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, this one, and this is one of these challenges when we're trying to allocate future money when we don't have a design yet. So this basin, we have AECOM currently working to do the cleaning survey and modeling to develop project options, kind of similar to what we've done in like Central Park or some of these other basins. At that point, we'll be able to say, here are the projects we recommend kind of in order of cost benefit, and then allocate the amount of money we think is appropriate for those. This, what Ms. Wharton's showing here is what was sort of sitting in the original TIF allocation for Cooper River Bridge for drainage work.
Right.
And then I think that the number you've probably seen, I think, was just a placeholder number that was put together as part of the looking at options for future TIF dollar bonding. In coordination with the design centers, we kind of were looking at a different basket of projects that could be done out there. It's just too early to really have a good sense yet. We know it's not going to be inexpensive to fix the area, but at some point we'll hit a diminishing return portion of the curve that it stops making sense to keep making improvements. I just don't have that information yet. I need another 6 to 12 months to give you a good set of financial numbers out there.
That's great. Okay, thank you. At least we're working on it. Thank you.
Yes, we've made really good progress in the last 6 months or so. That's where we did that 10,000 feet of cleaning there in order to be able to go in and do the survey work. And we're actually able to start building the computer model right now. So it's the wheels are turning and the momentum's gathering on that one, but we're unfortunately not quite there yet.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wharton?
Okay, so then we have the Limehouse Brick Arch Drainage Project at 1.875 million, and that's all stormwater bond.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Mayor?
if I may add on, this is kind of similar to the one we just mentioned in the fact that the 1,875,000 only rehabilitates a certain length of the bridge arch tunnel system, really a relatively small percentage of the overall system. So to totally complete, if this works and we see the benefits, then we're going to want to do more of the arch renovations. And so it would lead to obviously additional costs and funding.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right, Ms. Wharton.
Okay, and then so I just did a summary so you could kind of see all of those projects that we just discussed. It's almost $189 million.
Tell you what, that's a lot of nice projects though.
And then that's the funding sources for all of those. And it's just a little bit short because of the Market Street drainage project. So, grants has been the highest, is the highest funds that we're utilizing for a lot of that, but that's because of the SIB money for the Spring Fishburne project.
I was about to say, maybe if this is too short notice, but for the Mars meeting, can you maybe put a footnote on there how much grant money came in within the last, I don't know, 3-4 years? I think a lot of that 70 million has been recent. Am I wrong in thinking that way?
Yeah, it's mostly because of the SIB, yes.
Right. Okay.
So
good.
I had it broken out.
Well, you don't have to do it now. I just mean just put another
that total amount,
asterisk at the bottom.
almost $68 million of that is SIB money.
Okay, great. Maybe put another footnote at the bottom saying.
Okay. And then, so this is the projections that we have for the next 5 years. And it's really draft form because we don't have it, perfectly allocated out. But for the next 5 years, and it might be a little confusing, these are the fund balances. And of this fund balance, this is restricted for projects. And then we have unassigned fund balance. And the one thing that we're talking about is a reserve policy goal, like we have for the general fund, we have for the enterprise funds, and we have for the tourism funds. And how do we go about doing that? So we're doing some research and we'll bring something back to all of you on what is a good, it's just, there's not a whole lot of guidance on how you do that for a capital project fund. And so we're trying to internally figure out what would make the most sense, taking into the project contingencies that we already have built into the projects so that we're not reserving too much, but we still have something there just in case something, happens. So that's what we have in there for right now. So the annual addition to fund balance is what we would have on it each year for the next 5 years. And then that's the cumulative amount. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I tell you what we get lost in transition. It'll be good somehow, like for example, 2021, 2022. Maybe a chart can be done above this, say in 2021, the projects above, total is, 52.
Okay, well, yeah, I can add that. So this is after all the projects that we just discussed. And then
Right.
I have another slide that talks about unfunded projects.
That'd
as
be
well.
great, so how we'll know which projects qualify, 21 or 22 or 23.
And that all goes back to Mr. Fountain's small project allocation a little bit too.
Right.
Mr.
So-
Chairman,
Yes, sir, Councilman Griffin.
couple questions. First off, man, that looks so much better than what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
So that's great. Can you kind of explain, Amy, the cumulative available to spend and then the additional dollars available? What is,
So this right here, this would be to spend by fiscal year. So this would be above and beyond what we need in the drainage fund every year. And then if you add all that up cumulatively, that's what it is. But for each separate year, that's about how much we feel like we would have extra every year in the drainage fund that we could
Right.
allocate to other projects.
oh, right, because the cumulative available to spend, we've got those projects that we have sitting out there that we haven't funded yet. So that's
Right.
after taking them into account.
Right. So this right here would be the actual additional dollars available right
Well,
here.
dang, we've got $9 million right there.
However,
Change order, man.
my caveat is also that we're still working on that fund balance policy a little bit. So
Right.
those numbers might change a little bit depending on what we bring back to y'all.
All right.
And Ms. Horton, maybe just,
Significantly, though.
can I just try summarizing that once too? Because I think this slide is incredibly important and is easy to get lost in because of the numbers. But so the 2021, $9 million is kind of the additional money beyond what's been allocated into projects. Then the next year, it's another $7 million in theory becomes available. Then the next year, 3.4 million more becomes available, then 1.9 million, then 3.8 million. So the cumulative is showing you if you assign no new projects in 2025, you would have accumulated an additional fund balance of like $25 million that you could be using on projects. But the per year rate is showing you how much comes open each year. Because we do bring in revenue, but we also spend at a different rate than the revenue. So like you see up front, the first couple of years, there's some bond refinancing, there's some grant money that's come in. But the later years, 2024, 2025, we're not doing as much project work in those years, but we're also not bringing as much revenue in those years.
Right,
So
but
that's why the
those
numbers
years,
come down.
those years already have the projects that we have, not
Correct.
necessarily funded, but estimated, they're already included.
Yeah, so all the projects that Ms. Wharton just showed, those budget numbers are all included as allocated money already. So that's not within those additional dollars. The additional dollars are actually money that could be allocated into additional projects over those next 5 years. It's just we can't spend the whole $25 million in 2022, and partially because of engineering purposes, but also some of it doesn't become available until 2023, 2024, 2025, if that makes sense. Okay.
Go ahead, Council.
I've got a question. What explains the different numbers, in each of these fiscal years regarding what's allowed? Is that just purely a a function of when certain expenditures are coming due based upon our already planned project expenditures, or is it some other?
It is. So we have a cash flow of all the expenditures for the project. So you just might have more expenses in one year than the other. And so some of these projects are just getting started. So that's why you'll see it decrease, because you'll have bigger expenditures in those later years.
Gotcha. Because I would imagine that our revenue is pretty inelastic, pretty fixed based upon our stormwater fees and that kind of stuff.
Well, with only with one exception.
In this at all, those are for the operating side. This is all just the drainage millage. And then
gotcha.
Right.
And I'll say the only exception from revenue side is the grant money, right? It's sort of an inconsistent revenue stream that it cancels out expenses, but it's not a continuous stream. So like the infrastructure bank money primarily comes in 2021, 2022, and 2023.
Got it. Thank y'all.
Ms. Warren, can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
No, the one that lists all the projects and the amounts. So, Mr. Fountain, am I missing a doo-wop in here somewhere?
So again, Mr. Chairman, these are the ones that have been currently allocated and budgeted by council. So DuPont Wapu has design funding, which is not shown on here. And it had the original kind of study side, which is not shown here. We try not to go back in time as much. This is the projection, I guess, of future spending, but you're right. We don't have the design money shown within this one for DuPont Wapu. We do show it on, I think, the next set of slides for how much it'll be for construction as one of the potential projects to allocate money into.
The reason I think it's important to show that is because that thing is so important. I think it touches on, I know, at least 4 council districts, maybe 5. So anyway.
And some of that, so there's more projects that we've worked on than are shown on there. Those are kind of the major capital allocated items,
right.
Somewhat just for being able to read it and have it be in a font size that anyone can see.
Right.
But I think, Ms. Wharton's about to jump to the slide that I think you're looking at, Mr. Chairman, which is what other projects do we?
And so there was no current or future expenses, right, Matt? We've already spent that money on the design.
So there's the design money is all to be expended this year in that collaborative work with the county, but it was also funded out of the small project account, not out of the drainage fund. So it's sort of a cross. That's where we're talking about that this matters for the small project allocations, because we funded that design work out of the small project allocation last year. So it doesn't show in the drainage fund cash flow calculations. It only shows in the small project cash flow allocations.
Okay, good. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so then next we have unfunded. So these are the unfunded projects that we have a cost assigned to, or that we're expecting anyway. Earhart Tunnel was a $14 million. We have applied for a CDBGR grant in that amount, almost $10 million. So our city portion of that project would be about $4.2 million. And then here's the DuPont Wapu areas 1 through 4 and 5 through 8. Central Park, Wamba, and Broaden, Lockwood, Newall. And so I don't know if we have any questions on those.
Well, I do. I mean, so the funding for DuPont Wapu, where's that going to come from?
Well, it could come from that excess money you just saw on that 5-year projection. Total over 5 years was 25 million, right? So that hadn't been allocated yet, and we've got some decision making to do, but these are very logical prospects, so to speak, for that allocation.
All right, the Central Park Wamba, does any of that 3.48 factor in? Remember, we were going to refinance a bond and hopefully recapture lower rates. That was going to hopefully create more money for bonding.
So we're talking about that in terms of where we go forward and how we do that.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry.
Councilman Griffin?
Yes, these projections, they don't allocate or project any money coming out of the Church Creek TIF yet, do they?
They do not.
No, so
These are
that's
just the cost of the project, not necessarily how we will fund them. Those are decisions that
Right.
we'll need to make going forward.
our numbers and showing the available funds. That's another funding source that we haven't even tapped into yet, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
And then these were additional projects as well that I think have been discussed. I don't think you really want me to read every single one of them.
No,
I'll
no.
let you peruse. We just do not have any numbers to assign to them
Sure.
yet.
Now, how do we take a list like this and come up with what are the priorities? Are we still waiting on AECom to release their findings on some of these projects?
So they did develop the prioritization system. We have that. We've been working through and testing it, and we think we have it in a pretty good place. So the next step for us is to start working through these projects and scoring them. The previous slide that Ms. Wharton had are relatively straightforward for scoring because we have that conceptual work done. So these would be relatively straightforward for having the data available to score them. The second set of projects, some of these we could score. We could take very conceptual scores. It's hard to have it, it's just this age-old problem of engineering, right? That you have to almost spend money to figure out how much money you need to spend in order to do the rest of the project. And sometimes you find out it's not a good path forward and you need to back up, which is very frustrating to everyone. But these are where we talked a little bit at the budget ad hoc with potentially looking at using the utility fee to almost develop like a concept budget each year to say, let's put a couple of these projects through a $50,000 type assessment to figure out how much would this actually cost to do, what would it look like, what are the cost benefit ratios and the other scoring ratios for projects. And not all of them need, some of them need more money, some need less money to do that. But we can certainly take a stab at scoring them initially. It's just very hard to come up with cost estimates. Often you look at something like the, let's say the Alberta Long Lake drainage improvement, you can say, well, it's almost certainly going to be somewhere between $2 million and $15 million. And that's just too big a range to be useful when you're looking at real design work.
Well, we have an idea of what Church Creek's going to cost though, because we did a cost analysis on those projects.
Right. So we could score the projects that Weston Sampson had put forth, but if you remember right, with those, the challenge with those is that most of them rely upon the pump station being built. So you end up having that as your kind of core project. So the add-on projects are relatively inexpensive, but that core project is a high valuation project. So we haven't gone back and scored it because we weren't sure we'd have that kind of funding allocation available.
So
But
what,
there are, for future projects, we are looking at these other options in that basin with kind of what Biohabitats has put together with acquiring more property, building these flood storage options,
So-
potentially. I'm sorry, go ahead, Councilman.
are they looking at an alternate plan that doesn't revolve around the pump station?
They're looking to see what else we can do in addition to a pump station. It wouldn't necessarily, you could still build a pump station if we ever have that kind of funding allocation. If we don't, you can build other projects that will do improvement. And the way to kind of leverage it is sort of similar to these, Dutch dialogues, no regret style projects of saying that even if you built all the other projects first and you still wanted to go back and build the pump station, you could build a much smaller, less expensive pump station in theory.
Yeah, because the pump station was like 25 million and just the list of all of the projects was 50. So that's half right there.
Right. And we've all seen that pump stations are very difficult and expensive and long duration to build, unfortunately.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I did want to add a comment, and this might be stating the obvious, but I'd like to say it, is that every one of these additional potential projects, if there's any appropriate grant funding or other way to pay for it, we're committed to looking for it. I'll give you one example, the VA hospital drainage lift station. We've been talking with them about them taking on that project through federal funding. And that's just one example, but going forward, everything we look at, we do try to think out of the box and think of any grant opportunities or other ways that we can possibly pay for them.
Appreciate that, Mr. Mayor. And I tell you, this approach, and I hope after this Ms. Wharton and Mr. Fountain, I hope we can push this out to the entirety of council. Maybe they can get a quick glance at it before tomorrow's meeting. But, that's that broad approach that I believe if we continue to build momentum, eventually we can have, some sort of, again, half-cent sales tax, even if we have to join in with the county. Because obviously West Ashley, James Island, Johns Island, you got in city and out of city, even up Cane Hoy Peninsula, in and out, that, we fix our stuff. If the county can't fix theirs, it doesn't do a lot of good a lot of times. So, I'm a big fan of half-cent sales tax, work for the transportation and the bridge, certainly work for schools. I think it can work for the city. Okay,
Mr.
Ms. Wharton.
Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Councilman Shea.
Thank you. And I have two questions. One's for Amy, one's for Matt. Matt, the Fort Royal, one next to the bottom of the last one, is that going to be considered a major project, or is it going to fall within our small project allocation?
Yes, that's a good question, Councilman. That's one of the things I wanted to kind of touch base on some of these items before we talked about the small project allocation. So I think what we've sort of started looking at is things that we expect to be more than $250,000 probably makes sense to look at from drainage fund perspective, because we're really getting into capital project territory with that kind of expenditure, unless we want to at some point significantly increase the amount of money within the small project allocation. Because when we're talking about $1 million per year, if we start trying to fund $300,000 or $400,000 projects out of that, we really only have the ability to do 2 or 3 projects. So that's kind of the threshold we've been looking at, but it's still fluid. I mean, we're still obviously figuring our way through the small project allocation as we go, since this will be just our second year of doing it.
And perhaps what we need to do at some point, I know we can't do it now, is increase that from the $1 million to maybe an incrementally $1.25, $1.5, $2 million project. I mean, that maybe something down the line, but something to be considering.
It is. I mean, we have a little bit of a gap right now between these sort of projects that are $5 to $10 million and projects that are $50,000, $100,000. And that's one option, is to try to close that gap by saying we could use more small project allocation money for those kinds of work, or we can bring the drainage fund level down and start looking at those out of the drainage fund. But you're right, we got to figure that out one way or another.
Thanks. So Amy, my other question is about grants. What is the criteria for those grants? Are they all just federal grants for capital improvement projects? How are they mainly structured or couched?
It could be anything. It's not necessarily all federal. Matt could probably, looks with our grant writer a lot on these, but it's not just federal grants, and they have all different kinds of requirements with that.
The reason I'm asking that question for both of y'all is that, and the mayor brought this up a second ago, when you look at some of these institutions like the VA and American University, is there a certain criteria that we're addressing hospitals or a federal institution or installment to help us with that grant process?
There is. So, and sorry, Ms. Warren, I mean to jump.
Oh, go ahead. You're good.
I think he's probably glad for you to take that.
Yeah. So the grant, Ms. Warren's right. The grant, there's a whole series of different grant options. The ones that everyone's sort of familiar with are the FEMA grants, which historically have actually been very challenging to use. And FEMA is in the middle of redoing their whole grant program, basically to create the BRIC grants, the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. Maybe I'm going to butcher that acronym, but it's sort of their attempt to redo the PDM grants in a way that's more applicable for entities. No one knows exactly how that will go. This is the first year to apply, so we did apply just to try to get a sense of how the plan works and how they'll be allocating. But that's where they expect to have the major kind of traditional FEMA grants, about $500 million a year potentially across the country. The grants we've been successful with have been pretty varied. I mean, obviously we've done a number of the buyout grants with FEMA. We've done the infrastructure bank, which obviously is a state level agency. Right. We've had success with SERIA recently, which is a state agency, the state grant agency. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is actually funded mostly through NOAA, sort of a federal agency that gives out grant awards basically on behalf of NOAA primarily. Obviously, we've had some success with the Army Corps of Engineers as a federal agency. But then we've also had some smaller success stories with some other more varied approaches between even things like the Green Belt or looking at some of the land banks and Ducks Unlimited and some other options in the area. But you're right, Councilman Shaden, that the hospitals are an area we've been targeting primarily for these kind of large scale state and federal grants, because on a cost benefit ratio, which is the traditional way that most of those are viewed, those do score better. So the recent Earhart grant application that Ms. Wharton showed for, I think it was $9.9 million roughly. That's the HUD CDBG MIT funds, which is basically federal money using a traditional FEMA cost benefit ratio. And it does score, that project scores extremely high in that approach because of the service profile that a hospital has with serving low income communities and serving kind of a broad range of critical services. So that's a really good target area for grant applications that we've been focusing on because of that traditional cost benefit ratio. Like then you go out to Johns Island or Church Creek, and we're focusing more on like the natural and resiliency type grants, natural program resiliency type grants like National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, because those areas generally don't score as well from like a traditional cost benefit economic driven ratio, but they score really well from a, what has kind of suburban sprawl / overdevelopment led to problems with flooding. So we try extremely hard, and certainly our grant writer does a great job with helping us with this, Sarah Fischera, but we try extremely hard to find projects that fit well into a grant rather than saying, here is a pot of money, let's apply for something that we need to fund. And that's part of the reason I think we've had more success recently with bringing those grants in, is that grant agencies have strong preferences on what they want to see. So trying to find the right project to align with the right grant makes the agency much happier, and it's much higher probability for funding success on those projects, because the grants are a huge amount of effort to put the grant applications together. And the grant agencies get a little irritated over time if you keep submitting things that are not what they want to be funding. So we were trying to build those strong relationships as a city.
That makes perfect sense. Because I think, what was it, 35 million was the grant allocation that we had received?
It was actually more than that because.
So, yeah, 70 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a great deal of that is Spring Fishburne with the Infrastructure Bank. And again, the Infrastructure Bank wants to see large scale projects that benefit regional transportation, right? So for them, fixing Septima Clark, US 17 corridor was a great kind of meshing of priorities on that project.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. I clarified a lot of.
Right. Councilman, let me say this. We're getting close to 2.5 hours into this meeting. So
You were going way over my.
I know. I'm breaking your record. That's saying something.
We may even go beyond city council meeting tomorrow if we keep this.
Can't do that. Ms. Wharton, we have, how many more slides we have to go?
Not a lot.
Okay.
I can go fast. So
All right,
next
good.
steps is to work with the financial advisors on the financial model that some of you have seen before, where we change different scenarios in terms of stormwater fees and things like that to just look at that for stormwater fees and for millage, and then additional bonding capacity.
All
So
right.
we're planning on a meeting in April to go over that with them, but I think Councilman wanted that to be a little sooner. Yes?
Yeah, that's great. Great idea.
Chairman,
Yeah, Councilman Griffin.
Amy, any way we could do a workshop or something after the April budget ad hoc, or something
Yeah.
along those lines?
Actually, we had discussions about that. You want to touch on that, Ms. Wharton?
So we thought we could maybe do a joint meeting between ad hoc and public works committee so that everybody could be a part of it.
That's
If
perfect.
that would be better.
This is the most valuable slideshow that I've seen in a long time. So anyway, we can give everybody the chance to go through this.
Right.
Okay. So that's what we're planning on doing. And then we just had one additional project just because it's also kind of short on funding, and because Mr. Fountain also manages this project, but it's a low battery seawall. And we're about $31 million, $30.8 million short for funding that right now. So that is another project that we'll have to think about as well, and how we're going to go about funding that. We had been reserving about $5 million every year with the exception of 2019. We maintained that level of funding in 2020, but we couldn't do that for 2021 just because of our projected revenue decreases. So even with that, even if we continue to contribute $5 million every year, we still wouldn't, it wouldn't be enough to cover the full cost of the project because the project is moving faster than we originally had anticipated as well.
That's a good thing. So what, do you have any suggestions, Ms. What?
This could be another thing that we think about for a revenue bond if we wanted to do that. But
Revenue bond?
yeah, you know, we do ATAX revenue bonds. We could, you know, think about a hospitality revenue bond.
Right.
So,
Okay.
but the worst case scenario would be that we would have to pull money out of the drainage fund, right?
No, I don't think we could use a drainage. It's not really a drainage project. It's a flood protection project. So we had never anticipated ever using drainage funds for the seawall.
But
Okay,
again,
so
while the interest rates are down, you know, if we're gonna do a bond, you know, time to do it.
Right, but with our revenues, we don't want to borrow money before we need it and have it sit there though either with our
I
revenues the way that they are. So
I-
we just need to look at it. It's one other thing we need to look at.
Okay.
I know you're trying to say something.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I did want to add on this one that we are hearing out of Washington that the administration and the Congress will likely bring forward some infrastructure funding, and they'll be looking for shovel-ready projects. And this is more than shovel-ready because we've already got the shovel in the ground.
Right.
But I think this would be a great candidate for us to take to Washington, D.C. and ask them to help us finish funding this one. So that is, we've already been thinking about that and talking to our representatives up in DC about that, presuming that availability comes forth later this year.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And that's really all that I had. That's the last
Thank you
one.
so much.
Woo! That was a lot. That was great. I mean, that's great.
That's
Wonderful.
good stuff.
Really is.
Ms. Wharton, when you come, I'm gonna start putting an admission fee. We can raise additional monies by charging Councilman LaPel and Griffith and others to attend this meeting.
Does this count as our stormwater management update, or we have one of those as well?
Mr.
We
Fountain.
did that last week, last meeting.
Yes, we did the update last meeting, so we don't have another
That's
update
great.
until
That's not
next
on there,
meeting.
but we do have is one last item is the update on proposed revisions to underground district ordinance on undergrounding advisory committee.
Mr. Chairman, we do have
What?
item 4, Mr. Chairman, still on the small project allocation.
Project.
Oh, right.
So none of that was covered on that slide?
It was not. There's a lot going on project wise on the.
All right, Mr. Fountain, you up?
And we can. I mean, if you'd like to, we can move it to next meeting. But I can at least give you a very brief overview of it if you'd like.
Yeah, let's move it. Let's move it to the next.
Let's move it to the next meeting.
Okay. And I'll send out some information about where we are with small projects that are available for funding that I know about, and a description of each of those projects for the committee. So please let me know if there's projects you're aware of that are not on the list for
Okay.
consideration, because it's the ones that I have accumulated over the year and how we've set them up, but we can talk about that in more detail again at the next meeting. as
When you
well.
send it out, you can send it out to all 12 council members, aren't you?
Yes,
Yeah,
if
good.
that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Good deal. Yeah, that's
Okay.
what I want.
Normally I like to bring it to you first and then make
That's
sure you're good
okay.
with it going to the rest of council.
Yeah, I kind of ran this meeting long, so let's get it out to everybody.
It's my fault.
So I will send out this PowerPoint presentation to all the council members
Thank you
tonight.
so much.
They have it.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's not yours, it's mine. I'm supposed to be running an orderly meeting here. Item I, updated, who's going to touch on this underground advisory committee?
That's where we're wearing. That's going to be me,
McLeany?
I think. Yes, sir. And I'm going to have the worst, the least informative slideshow you've ever seen to follow Amy. This is just going to be a quick update on what's going on with the underground, the undergrounding advisory committee. And I expect we have a meeting, I think next Thursday, and that we will hopefully have things wrapped up. But I just wanted to give you a quick update so that you're prepared once that comes, because it's sort of convoluted in itself. But this is sort of the way things are headed right now. So under the current ordinance, we have what's called a petition method. Like 66 2/3% of the neighbors submit a petition. That triggers a process where Dominion will fund designs for the neighborhood, and they'll do up to 2 neighborhoods at a time. So there'll never be more than 2 pending designs. Once the designs are done, it'll be up to the neighborhood and the city, working with the neighborhood to some extent, to get all the easements in place and to sign a second petition agreeing to contribute a fee to the non-standard service fund, the undergrounding fund, to pay 15% of the project costs. And then once that's done, city council will adopt an ordinance authorizing construction of that project. It seems to be taking 10 or 15 years for people to get, once they get their design, to get all the easements in place, to get the second petition done and to submit it to city council, which is delaying the projects. As a result, we have, a very large balance in the non-standard service fund, but it's controlled by our franchise agreement with Dominion Energy. So it's not money that's sort of generally available for the city. It has to be used for these non-standard service projects. But under the current formula, the city pays 35% of the project costs, the neighborhood pays 15% of the costs, and then Dominion pays the remaining 50% of the costs. There are 7 neighborhoods that are still waiting. Ansonboro, Country Club 2, Wapu Heights, South Battery, Trad Street, and Legree Street, Old Windermere, South Windermere, then a portion of Clifford Street. Those have all submitted first petitions. Ansonboro and Country Club 2 have their designs. Country Club 2 has gotten all their easements, and we've authorized construction of that, which means Wapu Heights can now get their site designs done by Dominion Energy, and then they'll gather all their easements and try to get to the second petition phase. As you can, if you haven't fallen asleep during this explanation, it's a very convoluted process, and it causes a lot of these to be backed up. One of the primary, I think, goals of the committee is for the city, especially, city council, to be able to utilize the funds both from Dominion and the city to do projects without waiting 10 or 15 years for people to get their stuff together and on this list. Savannah Highway might be an example, or there may be city-owned areas where we want to underground utilities. And so I would say probably the number one goal of this exercise, or of the committee, is to enable council to use funds for projects that don't follow that convoluted method. So that's going to be in the ordinance. Secondly, we'll retain the petition method, and the people that are still waiting will still have some priority status. So once either Wapu Heights or Ansonboro gets construction approval, then South Battery, Trad Street, and Legree Street, they'll move to the top of the list to get design plans done. But in the meantime, that might be 10 years from now. In the meantime, city council can say, well, we want to split 50-50 with Dominion. I keep wanting to call it SC&G. This project over here, we don't need a petition from the neighbors or anything like that. We're just going to go ahead, and the city will pay 50% from the undergrounding fund, and from the money already there. Dominion will match that 50%, and we'll go ahead with that project without waiting for Wapu Heights or Ansonboro. Wapu Heights or Ansonboro to get to the next petition phase. The other big component of this is putting together a priority list, which would go through, I believe is drafted to go through Public Works and then be recommended to City Council, and also the ability through the same process, to reprioritize at any given point in time by City Council. So there's no, like, if you're third in line, you're not vested to that, because the city for, in response to a disaster or just a new project that comes along, city council still maintains discretion to reprioritize, keeping in mind that if once the conditions triggered for those 7 projects that are still outstanding, if those are met at any time, they automatically go to the top of either the design list or the construction list. But during the interim, city council has the ability to do other things. And this is just sort of outlining all that. The big difference with doing it that way is the city's contributing, instead of 35%, we're contributing 50%. It doesn't come from general funds. It comes from non-standard service funds that, under the franchise agreement in place since 1996, Dominion doesn't withhold, but they send us a separate check from our franchise fee for that separate amount that's spelled out in the franchise agreement. That ends up being about $530,000 a year, and there's a cap on how much it can increase. For the last few years, it's been about $530,000 a year. Again, Dominion would match up to that amount. If during a year we used it all for a city council approved project and didn't need it for a project on the list, Dominion would match up to the $530,000 for the projects we did. So again, under the new ordinance, previous projects still have priority, but city council also has the right or the ability to use the non-standard service funds, which is the undergrounding fee, the undergrounding fund. Tracy, who I think was not supposed to be able to join us, but I think she is on the phone, has sort of drafted guidelines for, we don't want it to be completely discretionary. You need some basis to build your decision around, to use the funds, so there's no equal protection type issue. So she's built in standards that the committee has reviewed and hopefully will finalize, that will guide city council and public works and then city council in creating the priority list moving forward.
Mr. McQueen, let me
Yes, sir.
interrupt just a second, please. Are we looking at any other funding methods besides this for undergrounding? Because we'll never be able to underground Savannah Highway or St. Andrews Boulevard. And I think the only way you get bike pedestrian paths on Savannah Highway is to underground the wires, which would create the space for bike pedestrian pathway on Savannah.
Yes,
my
sir.
understanding is that North Charleston used a number of ways to underground International Boulevard. And so I'm up around the Coliseum and all of that. I'm just wondering whether we're using all, I think Greenville had, I spoke to Mr. Cassis with SCE&G. That's probably about 2 years ago. There are multiple ways other cities are doing it. And I'm just wondering, we're going to revitalize West Ashley and make these boulevards look a lot better. We got to get more money than $500,000 at a time.
Yes, sir. And I'll say, Danny Mr. Is it Cassis or Casis? I can never pronounce his last name. He's sort of proposed, I think North Charleston and Mount Pleasant, they do, it's based on basis points, which is a percentage of your franchise fee. And I think I sort of calculated 50 basis points based on our last franchise fee, and it'd be like $900 something thousand. The problem is that's coming from the general fund. That extra, right now, that extra $400,000 goes straight into the general fund. So, I mean, certainly city council every year during its budget could allocate that $400,000 to from the general fund to the undergrounding fund if it wanted to, or it could amend the franchise agreement to do that and have Dominion match it. I think Danny has begun the process or has reached out to me, and we do want to sort of look at the numbers to see if there's a way that you could save, so Dominion would match up to the same amount.
Right.
So that creates about $2 million, let's say. I'm just going to round up.
Right.
And if there's projects that we pay for from the general fund and the reduction is enough that it would justify it, certainly you could do that. I mean, right now with our budget, we would have to get into a lot of the details of the
Oh, yeah. I understand that.
of the fund or of our budget in order to explore that more. And I've kind of said, in the meantime, you know, we don't have $400,000 anywhere that I know about. You know, that's kind of where we stand now. But any increase to the extent it would be on the table would come from the general fund. It would just be taken out of our franchise fee, and instead of going to the general fund, it would go to the non-standard service fund and be used for those projects.
Mr. Mayor, just, you know, thinking out loud, I'm just wondering, if there is money for infrastructure, from Washington, could underground wiring be part of that request as well? Anyway, I'm dragging the meeting out. Mr. McQueen, you're up.
And then, yeah, future projects could still utilize the petition method, but they wouldn't be prioritized the same way as the current projects on that list. They would still be on the priority list that's done by Public Works submitted to council. They would just have a higher priority because the neighborhood would essentially be agreeing to pay 15%. So that would, as part of Tracy's formula, that would be taken into account, that the city would pay less towards that project. Funding mechanism is still the same. And, you know, that may be worked out differently in the future. I think over the course of the short term, you know, I've spoken to Amy and Matt and gone through it. And I think they had the same impression I did, that there's, you know, unless there's there's just no money to do that right now without getting into more details in the budget. And, you know, that's something we can certainly look at. And then also, you know, we've discussed the issue about, especially moving the previous projects forward, being able to fund somebody to coordinate with Dominion, and whether or not that could be paid from the fund and somehow matched by Dominion. I think the benefit of that, I think maybe last year when we started this process, there was like $7.5 million in the fund. And that money will just sit there. It's only the city's money. That money just sits there until, under the current ordinance, until one of these 7 projects gets authorized. So we're just sitting on this money that we'd like to be able to use for undergrounding projects. Like Stony Field might have been one where we could have done that. So that's kind of the idea, is that person could coordinate to get those projects moving faster, and also kind of help with the other issues involving Dominion. We did something like that with the Magnolia Development Agreement, where as part of that development agreement, there's a consultant that works with Magnolia, and that's, I don't know, I think the developer like pays a portion of that consultant fee or whatever it is. So it would operate similar to that. So those are the major points. Again, I've got the draft ordinance, but it's I'm still waiting on comments from Danny, and then the Utilities Committee, I think, supports the current ordinance. It's just getting those comments and having the last meeting where they actually vote on it, because they do have to comply with FOIA. They pretty much all, at the last meeting, everyone who was present voiced approval of the ordinance as drafted. So that's, I don't know if any other members, or Councilmember Appel, or I don't know if Councilmember Del Chapo is still on, or the mayor or Tracy have any other comments, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Any other comments to what Mr. McQueen had to say?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayor.
I would like to thank Chip and Tracy and all the members of the committee, including Council members Appel and Del Chapo, and our chairperson, Troy Miller, who helped us on the golf course, also helping us on this one. And they've really worked through this. And the goal is to leverage this money that's just sitting in the bank and get it to use, and start getting some of these projects underway, and give us the flexibility to be able to add new projects that don't have all the bureaucracy of what was set up 25, 30 years ago. So two things I'll mention. One is on the existing projects, it will allow them, Ansonboro's example, Councilmember Del Chapo knows, where if they can't get all their easements in place, if they can just get a portion of them in place, that they'll be able to move forward with a project, even though it might not be the whole neighborhood. Maybe it'll just be half of it. And in a similar fashion, if South Windermere wanted to just focus on those few streets that had the most beautiful canopy of trees that they wanted to preserve and prevent future trimming from occurring, they could subdivide their neighborhood and try to get that moving quicker. But the flexibility is great because I've got three examples for you, Mr. Chairman. The Fire Station 11 project on Savannah Highway, the International African American Museum, we undergrounded right in front of the museum, and the little one here at Stony Field that we just approved the easement for tonight. We're paying 100% of that. With this ordinance in place, we could have split that 50-50 with Dominion and saved between those three projects probably about $1 million. So this is going to give us the flexibility to use these funds and get some things going. So I just want to thank everybody, and it should come to us, I think, at the next meeting or two. Thank you.
All right, great. Councilman Cheye?
You know, I talked to Susan and Chip about this because there's one of my neighborhoods asked me about the process, and I was just sort of stunned by the length of delay. And so whatever we do with this thing, we've got to figure out a better mechanism. 10 to 15 years from the part of the first inquiry, getting the applications in, getting the petition signed, et cetera, the mayor just mentioned, even getting a portion of that area approved. We've got to come up with a better solution and guidelines on getting this thing moving a lot faster. I mean, the folks who initiate this, they're going to be moved out of the neighborhood or long gone someplace else by the time they started, and they're not going to see the benefits of their hard work. So that's just my 2 cents worth. I just think we've got to do you use this term, Councilman Moore, and I like it. We can do better than that, and that's on this particular project, we can do better than that. We got to figure out a way of how to do that. And the other project that is getting a lot of attention, I want to get a lot of attention, is Old Town Road, about part of the revitalization efforts of West Ashley. That highway, that road needs attention on getting those lines down. But that's a different subject for a different time. I just wanted to throw that in there.
All right, thank you, Councilman.
Thank you so much.
Councilman Pell, if you would allow, we've had Council Lady Del Chapo on this meeting and I didn't acknowledge her being on this meeting from the very beginning. And so thank you so much. Ms. Del Chapo, do you have any input? Okay, good.
No, I don't have anything to add.
Well, thank you.
We had Councilmember Jackson on here too, but I guess she finally had to drop off.
Please let the minutes reflect. Councilman Pell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just want to echo all the everything the mayor said. There's a lot of good hard work that went into this process. Chip did an amazing job putting together this ordinance. This is a very complex legal document that y'all will see, and he worked very, very hard on it. And then Tracy McGee, of course, was very helpful in the process. Dominion, we had neighborhood representatives, Susan Pearlstein, Troy Miller, as the mayor pointed out. And Councilman Shea, I want to let you know that, your sentiment that you just expressed is exactly what we brought to the table when we got this process moving last year, which was, how do we get more dollars spent? How do we get more projects going? How do we get more things moving? And what sort of animated that process was, the thought process was, why should this be any different than all the other infrastructure projects that the city greenlights every day, right? Whether it be stormwater, whether it be traffic calming, whether it be, whatever the case may be, we don't have this sort of overly complicated multi-step petition process, all these different things. So we are now going to enable the Public Works and Utilities Committee, if I'm not mistaken, to help guide some of these projects and approve some of these projects as they come up, as the opportunities arise, just like we do with all other targeted infrastructure spending. And of course, we'll give priority to the neighborhoods that have been on the list and We have a matrix that Tracy's working on that'll help evaluate and determine which projects give us the best bang for the buck, sort of similar to what we're doing on the stormwater front. But this is just a great effort. And I'm going to be so excited when we start seeing some more of these power lines start to get buried, because that's ultimately the way we prevent some of this really aggressive tree trimming that we've all been seeing in our districts to one degree or another. So it's an exciting project. And this is a great milestone that we're sort of bringing it to Public Works and Utilities Committee, and hope to have the final ordinance passed this year, sooner rather than later. So thanks, everybody.
I agree. Thanks to everybody for all the hard work. Any last input? I think that's the last item on the agenda. Bringing a pretty important meeting to closure. A lot of important information discussed, but Councilman Shade.
Before we adjourn, Mr. Chairman, and I was getting a bunch of emails from some other folks about the tragedy that happened on King Street from the recovery room. Part of that was because of the sidewalk being blocked. And I just want to put on the agenda for next meeting a discussion about sidewalks being blocked and what we can do from a public safety standpoint of addressing that issue. So we don't need to discuss it right now. I did tell the folks that I would just bring it up to make sure it's on the agenda for discussion next meeting.
Okay, thank you, sir. Any last input? Hearing none. By acclamation, we stand adjourned. Good meeting. See you.